They're sick now. Okay, what is, and the other quarter's intrigued, what is a civil liberty? This is not defined in the Constitution. It doesn't say what is or is not a protected right as far as civil liberties goes. Liberty is a concept that has been adjusted over time based on changing values in society. The term liberty and right are often used interchangeably. Technically, a civil liberty usually refers to a political freedom, and a civil right usually refers to equality under the law. Civil liberties are often controversial because they often involve less than a majority of the citizens doing something that a majority of citizens disapprove of. Often the argument goes, as this little old lady tried to explain to me out in Tomball back in 2004. Often the argument goes that since a majority of people are against what this political minority is doing, and since we live in a democracy where the majority is supposed to rule, therefore the majority should be able to triumph over the minority. And if the majority of Americans don't want this person doing this thing, they should not be allowed to do this thing. This is an inherently conservative argument. Conservatism, based most closely on philosopher Thomas Hobbes, adheres to the principle that the rights of society should outweigh the rights of the individuals whenever there is a conflict between the two. That if push comes to shove, you go with the majority. You go with the authorities and do whatever the authorities tell you to do. Now, what's wrong with this Hobbesian argument? Well, the adverse view is the liberal or Lockean view that people have a right to do X, Y, or Z individually or as a small group, unless it is specifically prohibited in writing. Hamilton makes it abundantly clear in Federalist Paper number 78 that elected politicians may incite the majority to infringe on the rights of individuals, much as the Founding Fathers did during the Revolutionary War against Tories and other folks opposed to the Revolution. And that an appointed judiciary is the best guardian of individual rights, not the legislatures, not the executives, but courts are going to be the best protector of individual rights. Thus, the term liberal democracy is often applied to countries like the United States, where majority rule is balanced with legal protection for minority rights. Arguably, the most important of these minority rights is the right to publicly oppose governmental policies without them sending in the tanks. Policies presumably enacted by and for the benefit of political majorities. Throughout American history, the country's greatest abuses have come as a result of unchecked majority rule rather than unchecked individual rights. For example, the Mill Massacre of 1838. Mormons came to believe that Independence, Missouri is where the Garden of Eden will descend and reappear on earth someday. And so they start moving into Missouri in big numbers, but the Mormons would only trade with each other, sell with each other, kind of a thing. They had their own little kind of economic guild going on. The other folks in Missouri didn't like that. And so the governor of Missouri puts out a death warrant on every dead Mormon man, woman, and child whose lifeless corpse couldn't be stacked into a pile of the state capitol building is worth a couple of bucks. And so God-fearing Christian Missourians went all throughout the state and slaughtered and killed as many Mormons as they possibly could, because that's what Jesus would want them to do, and stack their bodies on the state capitol steps. One of just a couple of religious wars involving the Mormons in American history. And so usually individuals doing their own thing isn't really what causes as much harm as the government and the majority of people coming in and killing a bunch of Mormons, or like in the Tulsa riots of 1927, wiping out much of the black community of Tulsa and then trying to cover it up for half a century because they had basically just discovered oil in the black section of Tulsa and they were all about to get rich, and now they're dead. They're not going to get rich now. That kind of a thing. Additionally, the national majority does not have unlimited rights under the Constitution. Article 1, Section 9 lays out powers that are denied to Congress. Paragraphs 2 and 3 state, the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it. No bill of attainder or ex post facto law may be passed. So there are prohibitions against majority rule in the Constitution even before the Bill of Rights was written. A prohibition against the authority of Congress is a prohibition against the will of the majority of Americans. These are things Congress cannot do even if a majority of people elect people to Congress wanting to do it. The same can be said for the states. Article 1, Section 10 lays out the limitations on the will of the majority of states. Paragraph 1 prohibits states from passing any bill of attainder, ex post facto law, or any law impairing the obligation of a contract. And so there are even restrictions upon state governments in the Constitution as well. In addition to that, almost every state restricted itself with a written constitution. A couple were still operating under their old English charters for a while. And all except South Carolina had a Bill of Rights listed at the front of their Constitution. Preamble, Bill of Rights, structure of the government, in that order. The purpose of the Bill of Rights is to place limits on the rights of the majority. When you talk about limited government, you're talking about limiting what a majority of people can do. That's what limited government is, limiting what the majority of people can do to minorities. Additionally, the language used in the United States and state constitutions contain an assumption of freedom or perhaps an assumption of privacy. That means that when you look, for example, at what is in the state constitutions from the time the state Bill of Rights, a couple of which I have in the notes, are written with ought language. The word shall appears nowhere, but the word ought appears everywhere in the state Bill of Rights. Now, when I tell you that you shall not do something or that you ought not to do something, we understand that ought is looser. Ought means if you can keep from it. It implies there may be a reasonable exception. You shouldn't do that. You ought not to do that. Or if you're a coach, no, yes. Because he made a three-pointer, shouldn't have shot, that kind of thing. So you get the idea. Shall is like never, under any circumstances. You can't do this, period. No matter how good-looking the horse may be. So, once again, South Carolina comes kind of playing into that as well. Because there's a guy in South Carolina last year that got convicted for having sex with a horse. It was his second conviction for having sex with a horse, the same horse. So at least it's a monogamous relationship, So in any case, that in many of the textbooks, their American government textbooks, they argue, the founding fathers really didn't think much when they wrote the language of the Bill of Rights. And that's why you had the courts come in to correct the language or to clarify the language over the years. No, Congress was thinking pretty hard about what the language meant. The language is very different than what you find in the State Bill of Rights. If one were to propose a thesis, like Dr. Palmer at the law school, who also teaches history, does, that the Bill of Rights does not establish rights for U.S. citizens, but rather establishes a list of thou shalt nots directed against the United States government, does the language below support that thesis? And of course the answer is yes. Amendment 1, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, etc., etc., etc. They make it pretty clear that Congress can't do this. It doesn't say Congress in the states. It just says Congress. That in fact, Madison wanted to take the Bill of Rights and cut and paste it, so to speak, into Section 1, Article 9 of the Constitution, which is entitled Powers Prohibited to Congress. But Congress went against him on that, which is probably a good thing. Amendment 2, a well-regulated militia, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed by who? The federal government. Amendment 3, no soldier shall be kept in any house without permission of the owner. Well, guess what? Most state militias were volunteer. You're not going to kick them out of their own house, are you? You're talking federal troops. Amendment 4, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. And no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause. Well, again, the word shall shows up, and they don't list any exceptions. They don't list any exceptions. They do not list under what circumstances can the police do a search without a search warrant and still use that in court against you. Of course, as we will learn, there are at least a dozen exceptions that allow the police to search your house without a warrant and still use it in court against you. But if you actually read the Constitution, there aren't any exceptions listed. And they don't define unreasonable either. The whole idea, well, let's interpret the law as written. Let's just say what it means is what it says. Really? What's unreasonable? Do they define unreasonable in the Constitution? Is it defined here? If it is, it would indicate that any search without a search warrant is an unreasonable search. That's about the only interpretation that you could actually get to if you're not going to add anything else into it. So it also says, it does not say that the people now have a right to be secure. It says the right of the people as if this right was already existing. They recognizing that these rights are not established by the Bill of Rights, but are recognized as the Bill of Rights, in the Bill of Rights. That the government is recognizing rights that people already have in the Bill of Rights. Amendment 5, no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime. Once again, death penalty, constitutional. A capital offense means you're going to get killed for what you have done. And so they anticipated that states and the federal government would kill people from time to time. And so they wanted to make sure that they had it in there. So death penalty, constitutional, as it turns out. And unless on presentment of a grand jury accepting cases in the military, nor shall any person be put twice in jeopardy for the same offense, nor shall be compelled to be a witness against himself in criminal court, nor be denied life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Once again, deprived of life, death penalty. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Now here, we're talking about the federal government depriving people of life, liberty, and property. We're not talking about the states. State governments aren't mentioned here. And that's the way it stood for the longest time. That's what the paragraph basically says. Amendment 6 does establish 4 positive rights. Here they are saying the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial. They're establishing the right to a speedy and public trial. And the trial has to take place in the districts which shall have been previously ascertained by law. You will have the right to be confronted with witnesses against him, to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses, subpoenas, in his favor, and to have the assistance of counsel. So they are establishing 4 positive rights here in the Sixth Amendment for people accused of crimes. Don't let anybody tell you that criminals don't have rights, because the only rights established in the Bill of Rights for individuals are rights of criminal defendants. Seventh Amendment is one of the unincorporated amendments. The Second Amendment got incorporated last year, and I would edit that if Windows 7 would only let me. But in any case, the Third, Seventh, and 10th Amendments still do not apply to the states. And so we're going to pretty much ignore 3, 7, and 10. These are what are called unincorporated amendments. Amendment 8, it says that bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishment inflicted. Who is it that is prohibited from inflicting cruel punishment or imposing excessive fines or bail? Again, the federal government. Does not mention the states. Does not mention the states. Amendment 9 is a pretty vaguely written amendment. We'll come back to it. It lends itself to a variety of interpretations, is the best way to say it. What the Ninth Amendment means depends who you ask as to what it means. I've heard all sorts of different interpretations of it from all sorts of different people. That the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be denied, construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Does this mean that citizens have more rights than those listed in the Bill of Rights? Or does it mean that states have more rights than those listed? What are they talking about here in the Ninth Amendment? Which is still kind of weird. We'll get to that. 10th Amendment is supposed to limit the power of the federal government. Yeah, good thing that's in there. Because otherwise the federal government might be like way too big and out of control and spending a lot of money. And wow, it's okay. All right. Is the language in the Bill of Rights an accident of history? Most likely not. Because when you look at the Bill of Rights for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, or state of Pennsylvania, I should say, when you look at, and there it is, and when you look at the Bill of Rights for Virginia, also written about the same time, what you find is there's not a lot of shalls, but there's a lot of oughts, that the language is starkly different. They talk about how you ought not to deny people their rights. You ought not to do this, you ought not to do that. But it also talks about the responsibilities of the citizens. Like citizens are to be well informed as to who is running for office so that they can elect the people of the highest possible caliber. Which means, I guess, you're not supposed to watch Glenn Beck. So, and so it lists the rights of the citizens and says that these rights ought not to be denied or ought not to be granted to the government in this case, that they use the word ought all throughout here. The difference in the language in the U.S. Bill of Rights indicates a deliberate intent at the very least. The U.S. Bill of Rights was intended to restrict the actions of the United States government and not the states. At the most extreme interpretation, the Bill of Rights established protections for states, the people as a collective, and not for individuals. Either way, the Bill of Rights was not intended as a restriction on the state governments. No doubt about that. The original intent of the Founding Fathers was that state government should be able to treat people as they see fit. The federal government, on the other hand, is restricted as to how they can treat people. That's how the court ruled in Barron versus Baltimore, the case we covered on Exam 1. That the U.S. Bill of Rights only restricts the actions of the United States government. It does not restrict the actions of the states. Now, this changes after the Civil War because of the 14th Amendment. And by 1925, the Supreme Court decides, you know what? Your rights as an American citizen should not vary that much from state to state. That there are certain fundamental rights that all states should recognize, whether they want to or not. It's not until 1925 that the Supreme Court decides that your rights as an American citizen should be pretty much uniform, regardless of what state you happen to live in. So you see, civil liberties and the rights that you have are a function of the relationship between the federal government and the states. The Founding Fathers believed that by keeping state governments powerful, this would protect the rights of citizens. And that to erode the power of states would be to erode the rights of the citizens. Well, guess what? If you're talking about the citizens being white, male, Christian property owners, then they're absolutely correct. But that has not been the definition of the people now for about a century and a half. The definition of the people is basically everybody. Everybody. Non-white, non-male, and as incredible as it may seem, non-Christian, non-property owners are also citizens, thanks to the Civil War. And so by weakening the power of state government, you have increased the power of individuals. The opposite of what the Founding Fathers thought was going to happen. That as the state powers have been diminished, individual powers have increased. That as restrictions on state governments are imposed, people get more freedom. Usually in the 1950s and the 1960s. We'll get to those cases. Now, the problem with the Bill of Rights as written, if it was taken literally, that would mean there could be no exceptions, no matter how reasonable, to rights listed in the Bill of Rights. You could yell fire falsely in a movie theater. You could commit libel without sanction. You could engage in sedition routinely. And there would be no way to stop any of that. And so interpreting the Bill of Rights as written resulted in people having relatively few rights and being pretty much victim to state majorities. But once the Supreme Court in the 20th century decided to abandon original intent and to abandon strict construction of the Constitution, suddenly individual rights start popping up like mushrooms after a rainstorm. In other words, we enjoy most of the freedoms that we have today not because of the original intent of the Founding Fathers, but despite the original intent of the Founding Fathers. That they weren't nearly as much into freedom as has been advertised. They weren't quite as far into individual rights as advertised, in part because their definition of who should have these rights was about 10 to 80% of the population, depending upon the state. White, male, Christian property owners. These were the people that they were looking to protect in the Constitution. They weren't looking to protect Indians. They weren't looking to protect blacks. They weren't looking to protect slaves. They weren't looking to protect women. Most of the people in this country. They were looking to protect themselves. They were looking to protect themselves. That's about to become illegal in Tennessee. I'm not going to be able to say that in Tennessee. They're trying to make it illegal to say anything bad about the Founding Fathers in Tennessee. Define bad. Benjamin Franklin's fat. Do I go to jail now? Okay. That is no accident that most of the great civil liberties cases that expanded individual freedom came after the court-packing plan of the 1930s and the abandonment of dual federalist ideology. Strengthening the power of the federal government enhanced individual rights by restricting the power of the states from the 1930s to the 1990s. This is the opposite of what the Founding Fathers thought would happen. They believed the states would protect individual rights better than the feds, and it turned out to be wrong. Interestingly, since Lopez in 95, the case we talked about at the end of Exam 1, the states have generally expanded rights beyond the point where the feds are willing to go. For example, legalizing gay marriage. There's at least half a dozen states now that have legalized gay marriage. There's at least half a dozen countries in the Western Hemisphere that have legalized gay marriage. Most of the European countries have legalized gay marriage. And so today the states in many cases are actually expanding individual rights, and the federal government's the one that's kind of holding them back a little bit. Now, the incorporation of the Bill of Rights, incorporation, a term you're going to need to know for the test, incorporation refers to taking a prohibition against federal power in the Bill of Rights and applying it to restrict the powers of state governments. The first time this happened was in the case of Gitlow versus New York in 1925. This is the first time in American history where the United States Supreme Court said, you know what? The right to free speech is so basic and fundamental that you should have the right to free speech no matter what state you live in. Because as it turns out, the Constitution of the state of New York did not protect free speech. The ability to criticize the government publicly without going to jail, by the way, that's what free speech is. In this instance, incorporation means that a right has been determined to be so fundamental that no government at any level may violate it without good reason. It is ultimately up to the Supreme Court to determine whether a state or the feds have good reason to deny somebody their rights. So yes, government can deny you basic fundamental rights, but they've got to have a good reason for it. They have to have a good reason for it, at least theoretically. What we will find appallingly is many times rights have been restricted without very much of a good reason. A selected part of the selective incorporation means the court will consider on a case-by-case basis what is a fundamental right and what is not. That rather than taking all of the Bill of Rights and having it apply to all of the states back in 1925, the court said, well, we'll look at these one-on-one. Sometimes we'll rule that this is a fundamental right, and sometimes we won't. It's just going to depend. Being listed in the Bill of Rights alone does not necessarily mean the court will consider it a fundamental right, and not being listed in the Bill of Rights does not mean the court will not consider it a fundamental right. That the court has sometimes gone beyond the language of the Bill of Rights and ignored it completely at other times. The huge irony in all this is that the Bill of Rights was originally added to protect the states against intrusion by the federal government. And instead now, the Bill of Rights is invoked to stop the states from intruding on the rights of people, and the people intruding is the federal government. That the federal government intrudes on states' rights to protect the rights of the citizens living in those states. That's the part that Rick Perry doesn't talk about. He talks about federal encroachment, but he doesn't talk about how federal encroachment has resulted in more freedom for individuals, more empowerment of individuals than at any point in the entire history of the United States. We enjoy a great deal more freedom today than we did 50 years ago, thanks to the court's willingness to abandon the original intent of the framers, like I already said. Okay, what the textbook does is list important cases and precedents, but you don't have to read those chapters. You are going to read the chapter on the Texas Constitution. You're going to read the chapter on state and local government. Okay, so first off, no right or liberty is absolute. That if the government has a good reason to lock you up and not give you an attorney, they can do it. If the government has a good reason not to allow you to publish something, they can stop you from publishing something. If the government has a good reason not to allow you to worship, they can prevent you from worshiping. So they just have to have a good reason. Every right or liberty is balanced by the compelling interest of the state or government to protect the health, safety, and welfare of its citizens, which is why you cannot falsely yell fire in a crowded movie theater or have your kids spend the night at this guy's house. I really need to update the notes is basically what I'm saying here, because now it's not such a bad thing. The little alarm outside his bedroom that tells you when an adult is coming, I think that doesn't work anymore. For study purposes, focus on overlap, except that you don't read the Civil Liberties chapter, so forget about that too. First Amendment rights. It's good to come to class. First Amendment rights, starting with free speech. Perhaps the most important freedom in the Constitution is the right to free speech. Now, free speech means being able to criticize the government without sanction. Being able to criticize the government without sanction. When somebody goes out there and says something horribly racist or sexist or intolerant, and then people criticize it, people are like, oh, you can't do that. You can't criticize him. That's First Amendment. Okay. No. First Amendment does not prohibit us from criticizing people for saying stupid shit. In fact, that itself is covered under the First Amendment. It protects us from criticizing the government without any bad side effects, like incarceration or perhaps losing your job, unless, of course, you work at Lone Star College, and that's a different story entirely. All right. That there are so many different ways that people can express themselves politically that I and others, this isn't my classification scheme, this is somebody else's, has broken down free speech into 4 types of speech. Seditious speech, which has historically been the least protected. Pure speech, which has traditionally been the most. Speech plus conduct, which is kind of in between. Same thing with symbolic speech. Starting with seditious speech. Seditious speech occurs when somebody advocates violent action be taken against the government. Violent action be taken. For most of the 20th century, the big case was the 1919 case of Schenck versus the United States, where Schenck was a socialist who opposed U.S. entry into World War I. He makes a speech outside of the draft board where men are reporting for duty and tells them that you're going to war to protect American banks who have loaned money to the British and the French, and if the British and the French lose the war, as they were doing at the moment, then they might not pay, they're going to default on all these loans. And then all these banks are going to lose their money, and of course, the federal government's not going to come in and bail out the banks, because that's just something the federal government just isn't supposed to do. And if banks fail, you're on your own. But, okay. So he is arrested and convicted because at the end of his speech he had a call to arms. He said, hey, let's go to Washington and kick some ass. Okay, that's not what he said, but that's the idea. And the Supreme Court upheld his conviction. They said, yeah, you can't say that. You can't say that. Your speech comprised or composed or whatever a clear and present danger. Your speech presented a clear and present danger to the government, because there was a call to arms, and the government doesn't actually have to wait till somebody takes their gun and starts marching to stop this from happening. They can take preemptive action if they need to. That Schenck's defense was, I didn't see anyone marching on Washington. I didn't see anybody not reporting for duty. That kind of a thing. No harm, no foul, right? Supreme Court said, nope. If there is a possibility. Okay, Abrams was ignored by the court, and I have often considered removing this because Abrams was a decision that the court itself ignored almost immediately after they wrote it. because they were embarrassed. In Abrams, what happens is after World War I had ended, at least Schenck was making a speech during the war. World War I is over. We have tens of thousands of American troops in the Soviet Union trying to overthrow the communist regime there. How did that work out? And this is in the papers. 2 American socialists are opposed to this. They think that the troops should come home, so they write up pamphlets, and they basically throw them out of these windows of these apartments in New York, and they float it to the ground and basically say, call your congressman, tell them to pull the troops out of Russia. They're arrested and charged and convicted of sedition, even though there is no call to arms. There is no shoot your congressman. There was write your congressman, though. And of course, I guess the pen is mightier than the sword, so okay. In any case, the court here said, look, if you make a speech or print something up and as a result somebody reads that and becomes less patriotic, you can go to prison for it. It's called the bad tendency doctrine. Bad tendency doctrine. But then, once our communist scare was over by 1923, people look back on this and went, you know what? We went a little bit nuts back there in 1919. Let's just kind of ignore that. Let's not talk of this again. We'll enforce clear and present danger, but we're going to ignore bad tendency because, we're on the Supreme Court. Every day we say 3 or 4 things that might make people less patriotic, as it turns out. So, like listening to Christine Aguilera sing, that kind of thing. You might want to rehearse. That was the case until Brandenburg in 1969 puts into effect the incitement standard, which is still the standard today. Under the incitement standard, you can say anything you want to say as long as you are not in a position to carry it out. So you can say, I wish somebody would shoot the president, but you cannot say that if the president's on campus. You cannot email it to him either. I had a student back in the 90s that emailed a death threat to President Clinton, and the Secret Service found him because he signed into a lab and checked into a computer and then sent an email to the White House threatening to kill the president, and then was amazed to discover email has an address. It tells you where it was sent, when it was sent, and on what computer. It took them about 10 minutes to find out who sent the damn thing. Ay. But at least he knew that when it says in the syllabus there's no classes on the days of test, that there are no classes on the days of test. I had somebody write me last week to ask me if that's what that means. It says in the syllabus that we don't have lecture on class days. Does that mean that we don't meet? Next time I'll try to make it a little bit more clearer. All right. So you can say anything you want as long as you're not in a position to carry it out. You can say, geez, I wish somebody would burn down the White House. You just can't say it when you're at the White House. That kind of a thing. You have to proximity. You have to be in a position to carry it out. You can make a joke about having a bomb in your pants at the comedy club. You can't make that same joke at the airport. There's a guy 2 days after 9/11 was getting on a plane here in Houston. And he'd been stuck here for a couple of days trying to get somewhere. When he was going on there, they asked him what was in his bag, and he said, a bomb, okay? Yeah, he didn't make his flight. So, my wife works for TSA, the screener in Terminal C. She's got stories. Man, they find loaded guns all the time, knives all the time. And yes, there are people trying to smuggle bomb components onto planes. That they find this all over the place. That they're still testing the system. They're trying to get bombs onto the planes. So far, they haven't succeeded, nor are they likely to. On the other hand, it just takes one. So they have actually found this shit, but I'm not supposed to tell you that. So you didn't hear it from me. This doesn't work anymore. Okay. Get low was the first time anybody won a free speech case 6 years later. Until 1925, every time somebody alleged that their free speech rights were violated, they lost. Every damn time. Pure speech. I have gotten into more trouble for my lecture on pure speech than anything else I have ever done in the classroom. Ironically, it's for the stuff I say during the pure speech part. Ironically, it's for telling you about the cases. For example, Cohen versus California. This guy's walking through the LA County Courthouse in 1971. He's wearing a jacket, denim jacket. On the back of the jacket, in great big words, with a magic marker, he has written the words, "Fuck the draft." Some lady is there to, everybody okay? So lady was there with her kids. She sees the jacket. She calls the police officer over. The police officer asks him to remove the jacket. He refuses to do so. And so the officer writes him a ticket for public profanity. Even though he wasn't swearing, he was just had it written on his jacket. And so he appeals his conviction all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And in Cohen versus California, the Supreme Court says, look, you can say anything you want to say. You can write down anything you want to say. One man's vulgarity is another man's lyric. In other words, there are no illegal words. There are no words that are illegal to say or write down. Right? Like he whose name shall not be mentioned. That kind of a thing. There's none of that. There's none of that. Now, the reason I got in trouble is because I just did that, just as I did right there. And it had these two old blue hairs from Louisiana taking my class. And as soon as they heard the offensive four-letter word, draft, they went running to the dean's office, and then not here, at North Harris College, where the N stands for knowledge. And the dean comes running to my office. What are you saying in class? I got these old ladies. They're all upset. Blah, blah, blah. I was covering Cohen. Did you use the word fuck in class? I was like, oh, fuck, no. I never fucking do that. That's pretty fucking offensive. So it's like, well, why? Well, I was covering Cohen versus California. This is an important precedent that established basically the ground-based rules for free speech in this country, pure speech in this country. That you can say anything you want to say, but you can't necessarily say it anywhere you want to say it. That kind of thing. And she's like, well, could you do the lecture without mentioning the F word? Well, yeah, I could. Yeah, this guy's walking through the LA County Courthouse. He has something written on the back of his jacket which offends a lady so badly that she calls over a police officer, and the police officer asks him to remove the jacket. He takes the jacket off, is convicted of public profanity. What's the first question everybody's going to want to know? What was on the jacket? What was on the jacket? And then I have to tell them, I can't tell you. I can't tell you what's on the jacket because one person may be offended at what I say, and to protect the rights of that one person from being offended, I can't tell you the rest of it. But you can look it up online now if you want to, It's like, seriously? This is during the free speech lecture. So then she asked, well, maybe, do you have to cover the case? Just don't cover the case. It's like, I'm going to cover the case every fucking time I want to. You can't start telling me what I can or cannot cover in my classes, especially when it's directly relevant to what we're talking about. If I was covering, an episode of Community or something like that, then that's something that you got a legitimate complaint about, right? Okay. So that's one of the two times I've gotten in serious trouble. The other time, also going along with this as well. Anybody know who or what is the mascot for the University of South Carolina? Gamecocks. That's right. Somebody has a phone call. The Gamecocks. What is the, or who is, or what is the mascot for the University of Nebraska? Cornhuskers. Except they don't call themselves Cornhuskers anymore, do they? They just go with Huskers. Guess what? South Carolina, they don't call themselves the Gamecocks. They just call themselves the Cocks. Seriously. I had a friend of mine attending graduate school, at the University of South Carolina back in the 80s. And South Carolina is arguably the most conservative state in the country. Bless their hearts. And he was shocked at when he went to the bookstore and he saw all of the t-shirts and all of the sweatshirts and all of the pennants and all of the notebooks and everything. You know what they had emblazoned all over the place? Great big giant letters. Go Cox. Our Cox are the best. Or my favorite, nobody can beat our Cox. On everything. He saw little old ladies in their 80s walking to the football game with a shirt that says, "You can't lick our cocks." And the juxtaposition of something so obviously offensive in the most conservative state of the country made his head explode. He just stood there one eye went one way, one eye went the other way. Like, what? You know, the land of Pat Robertson, you got cock everywhere. Every permutation of cock, any possible way you could work it in. They've got it on their signs, they've got it on their clothes, just incredible. Now, when I told that story, just like that, once again at North Harris College, somebody went to complain to the dean again. And the dean came in and wanted to know, what the hell was going on in my class now? I said, well, I was just talking about the University of South Carolina. So it was content relevant. Yes, it was. Well, okay, but she was talking like she might file a sexual harassment complaint against you. It's like, file a sexual harassment complaint against the University of South Carolina? I'm just the messenger, okay? I'm not the one that wrote that shit, okay? I'm not the one that put it out there. I'm not saying go buy that kind of a thing. But this was in the 90s when political correctness was kind of, the arrow went too far in the direction of it. One of the funniest stories out of there was about this time at Penn State, where I had a friend teaching at Penn State. There was a student who took an art history class. She became unhappy because the art instructor made her buy an art book. And then when she opened up the art book with all these great paintings and stuff through history, oh my God, there were nude pictures of women in there. All over the place. As shocking as it may seem. And so she filed a sexual harassment complaint against the professor for making her buy the book with all the nudies in it, arguing that it was a form of sexual harassment. Of course, as soon as she did this, she instantly became the least popular person in the history of Penn State University. Everybody hated her. It's like, come on, it's art history, it's not Hustler. Okay? I was like, I think it's pretty graphic. And so she couldn't get anybody on her side. Literally nobody thought that she was on the right side on this issue. So in a sense of desperation, she took the book and photocopied the nude pictures and then stood out at the Commons and handed out the nude pictures to people. And 2 people filed a sexual harassment complaint against her for handing out nude pictures at the Commons. You have to wonder if at that point the light bulb went on in her head. Like, oh, right. If it's not okay for him to do it, it's not okay for me to do it. And if it's okay for me to do it, it's okay for him to do it. Never mind, of course, the whole copyright thing that you're, copying pictures out of a textbook. Well, let that one go on top of that, right? So in any case, just, okay. So, while there's no law that tells you what can or cannot be on a t-shirt, what can or cannot be on a jacket, If you ever get the chance to go to the Pearl Street Mall in Boulder, Colorado, you will see shirts with stuff on there that you will never see anywhere else in the English world. And I had about half a dozen of those shirts in my arms that I decided I could never wear that one. No, probably not this one either. Okay, no. And I gave them all up except for one, which in really small, little tiny print said, you're a what is there? It is curious bastard or something like that kind of thing on it. I thought it was funny. The one though that I wish I had hung on to, and I kick myself for this every time, is the one that said, "What the fuck are you looking at? Dick nose," with fucking dick nose like this big on the t-shirt. I should have got that. Just to show in class, not to wear, necessarily. Although that would be cool to wear that at Sturgis and see what happens, I suppose. It's called early retirement. Disability. Okay, so if like the LaRouche people, now what the government can do is they can't restrict what you can say, but they can restrict where you can say it. For example, public property is considered a public forum, but not all public property. For example, if the LaRouche idiots want to hand out their bullshit here at the U of H campus, we have to let them. But we don't have to let them in the buildings. We can even designate certain areas like the PGH building as a bullshit zone, which is only appropriate since that's where the political science department is headquartered, so so we can like say you can hand out the stuff over there, but you can't hand out the stuff here. Between social work and Arnold Hall. You can't do it here, but you can do it over there. And that's okay. Shopping malls are not public property, though. And so any private property, Rice University is considered private property. If the LaRouche disciples want to hand out their bullshit at Rice, they can't. Rice is not compelled to let them. But if they want to hand it out here, we have to let them. If they want to hand it out at the airport, they have to let them, but they can designate certain areas where they can hand out their bullshit. They can't just hand it out anywhere they want to. Okay. Speech plus conduct. Basically, protest marches and demonstrations. Pretty easy rule here. Whatever rules you have on who can march must be content neutral. That means that the rules have to apply to everybody. Whether it's a pro-war rally, whether it's an anti-war rally, a pro-gay rights rally, or an anti-gay rights rally, like those idiots from Topeka. That everybody has to be treated the same, no matter what it is they're saying, no matter what the content of their speech is, and therefore the content neutral. The big case here came out of Skokie, Illinois, a Jewish suburb of Chicago, where the American Nazi Party wanted to march back in the 1970s. At that time, Gerhard Lauck was the guy who was the self-professed head of the American Nazi Party, and I met him. That we lived in the same town. I had a radio show on this public radio station, and so did he. And so it's like, hey, how you doing? So, okay, I'll work on that. That has potential. And so in recent cases involve pro-life protesters having to stay 100 feet away from clinics, or city ordinances which prohibit vigils in private neighborhoods after dark or on weekends. All of these so far have been held to be reasonable. There's an interesting case before the court now regarding the anti-gay rights folks who go to the funerals of servicemen and claim that these servicemen are being killed because of our tolerance of gay people. That it's God's wrath. Is it really wrath when you lose 2 or 3 guys a month? That's not wrath, is it? Isn't wrath like losing 100,000 people a day? That seems like wrath to me. Wrath seems like a little harsh. Okay. Symbolic speech often involves conduct designed to piss people off. Many times, no speech is all that's involved. Three cases here. U.S. versus O'Brien, 1968. Draft cards cannot be burned. Funny story. During the very early anti-war protests in the 1960s, like 1965, men would often burn their draft notice in a bonfire at an anti-war rally. It was a misdemeanor. They still had to serve, even though the paper was burned. But when the papers started to cover this, and Congress discovered that these guys were burning their draft notices, they made it a felony to burn a draft notice, punishable by up to 2 years in a federal minimum security facility. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with how federal minimum security facilities work, most of them have tennis courts and golf courses. They don't even have fences. They have a line on a sidewalk that you're not allowed to cross. And if you cross it, you are told to get back on the other side of the line. They're not even locked into their dorms at night, unless there's been problems. And they get to go to school for free. They get free health care. And they get to play golf and tennis during their recreation times. And so, you just got the notice that you're going to go to Vietnam and you're not very happy about it. And so your option is to simply suck it up and report for duty. And you're going to spend the next 2 years in the shit in Vietnam. Or, you burn the draft notice, confess, get it on tape. Okay, you don't have tape in the 65. Get it on film. And then take it to the DA or local U.S. attorney office and turn yourself in. And you're going to spend the next 2 years at a federal minimum security penitentiary. Finishing your school. Learning how to play tennis. Yeah. What do you suppose happened to the number of men burning their draft notices after Congress made it a felony? Right, it skyrocketed. So by 1968, the Supreme Court's taken up the issue. Can Congress do it? Or is the burning of a draft notice a protected form of political expression? And the court ruled it's illegal. You cannot burn your draft notice. The reason it's not protected is because the draft notice is government property. Yeah, I know it's not worth much money, but they said, look, if does Congress have the right to pass a law protecting federal property? Sure, they do. Is a draft notice federal property? Yes, it is. So guess what? Congress's right to protect federal property outweighs your right to burn it in protest. Now again, this was not a unanimous decision. Very few of these decisions I talk about here are unanimous. Okay? There is a pretty good dissent on this one, by the way. Myself, I'm just trying to figure this one out myself. But it's a little bit like the dollar bills that you have in your pocket. These technically don't belong to you. They're in your possession, but this is federal property. This is federal property. That's why you're not allowed to, mark on it and do other stuff to it, or you're not allowed to mar it in a way that makes it look like it's worth more than $10, kind of a thing. Whatever. Should have had a 10. I had no idea. Tinker versus Des Moines, 1969. This girl and her brother, who looks disturbingly like Dexter, came up with this idea of how to extend their Christmas holiday. Over Christmas, they decide we're going to wear black armbands to school with peace signs on them to show our support for the POWs and MIAs in Vietnam. The other kids heard about it because kids talk. And so they go to school wearing the black armbands, and the principal meets them at the door and says, unless you take off the armband, you are not going to be allowed back in school. And the kids are like, okay, let me get this straight. If I take off the armband, I have to go to school and start doing schoolwork. Or I keep the armband on and I get to go back home and play with all the really cool stuff I got for Christmas. Decisions. And so they decided not to take off the armbands. They were suspended from school. They take their case to the United States Supreme Court, and in Tinker versus Des Moines, the Supreme Court said, you can't make the kids take off their armbands. If the kids want to wear the armbands, they can wear the armbands. So they got over the junior high administrators, which are the lowest form of administrative life on the planet, by the way. And that had to have been a pretty good feeling, as it turns out. I myself was in junior high about this time, and I decided I wanted a few days off. So me and a few other folks wore some black armbands to school, but we grew up in a college town. And so everybody was like, hey, right on. Damn it. My teachers are all hippies. Felt like Cartman. Johnson versus Texas, 1989. And again, I actually talked to somebody, interviewed somebody who was actually witness to this. Okay, we were on a date. But in any case, what happens is this guy Johnson is the self-appointed head of the American Communist Party, not Professor Bazanko. We're buds. So they're in Dallas in 1984, and they're protesting the Republican National Convention, and they're holding a spontaneous march with all 16 communists in America assembled to show their might. You know, being a communist in America is just a little bit like going to an all-you-can-eat buffet and deciding, today is the day I start my diet. In any case. I like that one. So, that nobody's paying attention to him. There's only like 12 or 13 people walking down the street shouting socialist slogans. Nobody gives a shit. Nobody's paying attention to him. So he came to this building where a flag was up on the pole, and so he pulled the flag down, said some rather nasty things, and then attempted to burn the flag. Because as it turns out, the flag was nylon. And so when he put his lighter to the flag, it did not so much burn as it melted. And so what they did is they put the flag on the ground, and then they broke open one of these big lighters and was trying to empty the lighter fluid on it and stuff. And they got the lighter fluid to light for a second, and then gone. So you got these brown spots in the flag and stuff, and so they're trying to fold it over like that's going to help somehow. And then they look up, and there's about 12 cops standing around them. It's like, good day, officer. And the cops asked them what they were doing and where did they get the flag. And so Johnson, who pulled the flag down from the flagpole, and so Johnson was arrested, charged, and convicted of desecrating a sacred national object. That in the court's majority opinion, written by Justice Brennan, I believe, the court first admonished Texas. It said, you know what, Texas? You could have charged this guy with at least a dozen offenses, as far as we can tell. Theft and destruction of private property in excess of $500 value, which is a felony. But you didn't charge him with that. You could have charged him with vagrancy, but you did not. You could have charged him with holding a parade without a permit, burning without a permit, trespass, all sorts of stuff you could have charged him with. And you didn't charge him with any of that stuff. The only thing you charged him with was desecration of a sacred national object. Now, when you look at the dictionary, what is the definition of desecration? It means to show disrespect. To desecrate something means to show disrespect for something. That the reason Johnson was convicted was not because he had burned a flag, but because he was having bad thoughts while burning the flag. Then the court goes on to point out that under the United States Flag Code, the proper disposal method for a flag that has been torn, tattered, faded, left out at night without a light on, has been soiled, touched the ground, it is to be burned. And who burns American flags more than anybody else? The American Legion. They usually burn flags, or the VFW, on Friday nights at sunset where they play taps, they take the flag, they throw it into this fire, so, it can burn and its soul can be released to heaven. And not a single member of any of these groups has ever been convicted of burning a flag, because they're burning the flag out of patriotism. So it's not the burning of the flag, which he's been convicted of. It's burning the flag while having bad thoughts. And as incredible as it may seem, we don't think we should be throwing people in jail for having bad thoughts. That you have a right to be unpatriotic in this country. You have a right not to love this country. And then the court ended with a really profound statement. We have an interesting choice here. We get to decide what's more important, the Constitution of the United States or the symbol of the Constitution of the United States. We think the Constitution is more important than a symbol of the Constitution. 75% of Americans disagreed. And every year around the 4th of July, the Republicans try to get a flag-burning amendment added to the Constitution to outlaw flag burning. Because, yes, that's what's wrong with the country today. Too damn many flags being burned. Yep, that's the problem. That's the issue. So Congress followed in U.S. versus Eichmann. Congress had passed a law to outlaw flag burning. And the court's response was, didn't you read Texas versus Johnson? That you can't throw people in jail for doing something for having bad thoughts. That it preserved the right to burn a flag out of respect, but you could not. And what is actually considered patriotic or not patriotic to do with an American flag has changed over the years. Back in the 60s, people got arrested for having a flag patch on their ass. But Barbara Bush attended the 1992 Republican Convention with an American flag handkerchief. And that was okay. It was okay for her to blow her nose in the flag, apparently. But to wear it as a patch was considered unconstitutional. Now it's constitutional. Not constitutional. Now it's patriotic. If you got a flag on your truck and it's all covered with mud and shit, then you're a patriot. Back in the 60s, you get shot for shit like that. Which is an appropriate segue to the other First Amendment, the religious clauses. By the way, I was writing the notes when I was thinking of getting a Harley from a friend of mine for about the same price as a new Segway. I was trying to figure out which one I want. That the Harley says I'm cool, the Segway says I'm too lazy to walk in from the parking lot. Could go either way. The religious clauses are supposed to work in tandem by prohibiting an establishment of religion. The free exercise of religion is protected. Countries that adopt or promote one religion or one set of religions do so at the expense of others. This idiot, for example, will tell you that, he'll tell you, many people came to America because they were being persecuted back in their home countries. And so they came to America so they could exercise religious freedom. He's absolutely right. That absolutely happened. You had a lot of people coming to America in the 1600s because they were being persecuted back home. The Puritans, the Quakers, the Amish, the Mennonites, all these people came over here because they were being persecuted. But what Pat Robertson doesn't tell you is, why were they being persecuted? And the reason is because they were not members of the official church back where they came from. And because they were not members of the official church, the government was harassing them, denying them their right to worship, even locking them up. And so that's why they fled Europe, was to gain religious liberty. And the reason they didn't have religious liberty back home is because their home governments all had official religions. And they were not members of those religions. And so the idea that the Founding Fathers got, that a lot of people like Pat Robertson don't get even today, is the fact that the two are intertwined with one another. That as soon as the government takes sides in a religious argument, the other side, whatever it is, will suffer from that. It's inevitable. It has happened without fail in every country, in every state government. State governments had official religions till the 1840s. People who were not members of that official religion were treated worse than people who were members of the official religion. So the Founding Fathers got this. They understood that if the federal government stays neutral in all religious matters, if the federal government just stays the hell out of it, everybody is on a level playing field. Now the thing is, Pat Robertson doesn't want a level playing field. He wants the playing field tilted for him. He says, look, all the Establishment Clause means is that the United States government cannot pick a specific religion, like Catholicism or Lutheranism. But it does not prohibit the United States government from adopting Christianity in general and Christian principles in general and spreading those and encouraging people to be Christians. Really? That's what that means? So here's the question. If the Founding Fathers intended America to be a Christian nation using our political institutions to promote Christianity and Christian beliefs, and they wanted to make sure that all of our leaders were going to be Christians, then why is this in the Constitution? Article 6, Section 3. No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. Why is that there? Why is that there? If the founders intended for Christians to have a political monopoly in this country and to use their majority status in this country to promote their values over the values of other religions, why is that in the Constitution? Why is that in there? It's because the founders didn't intend to establish this as a Christian enclave. The vast majority of people that came to America did not come here for religious liberty. The vast majority of people came over here to make money. Some of them did. Others came over here to help the other people make money. They were called slaves. The Confederate Constitution also had this prohibition as well. So enough preaching, let's get to the cases. One case real fast. Reynolds versus the United States, 1878. The Mormons had fled the United States and moved to Mexico. Well, Mexico territory. Specifically an area called Utah. So that they could practice polygamy. But then the Spanish-American War occurs. The United States gets Utah, Nevada, California, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Texas. And now Utah is back in the United States. Damn it! And Congress passes a law outlawing polygamy in any of the territories. The Mormons challenged this, saying, look, we sincerely believe that it's perfectly okay, and in fact it's perfectly moral for a man to be married to several women at the same time. There's also a practical part of this as well, since a lot of men died moving out to Utah, that most of the people that survived were women. There's a practical issue. There's a lot of women and not a lot of guys. That kind of a thing. But the belief in polygamy predates their moving out west. So we should be able to practice our religion as we see fit. And the Supreme Court said, no. You can believe anything you want to believe, but you cannot practice anything you want to practice. It's okay for you to believe polygamy is moral. We can't stop you. But we can stop you from practicing polygamy. Well, here's the thing. From a Freudian viewpoint, I think it's really interesting that when the 9 men on the Supreme Court were confronted with the idea of one man being married to several women at the same time, and they were looking for an analogy, human sacrifice came to their mind. They said, look, what if somebody believed in human sacrifice? Should we allow them to practice human sacrifice simply because they believe in it? Of course not. That the government has the right to protect the health, safety, and welfare of its citizens. So in other words, the people on the Supreme Court were sitting there going, wow, 6 wives. What would that be like? Being hit by a train? No. Shot by Indians? No. Falling off a cliff? No. Burned at the stake? No. The smoke knocks you out. I got it. Human sacrifice. That's what it would be like. It would be like having 6 people holding you down on an altar, and then they tear out your organs slowly and painfully as you scream bloody murder. That's what it would be like to have 6 wives. Just imagine the hell of it. Wherever you go with your wives, you have 6 people telling you where to go, how to drive, look out for this, that kind of a thing. And then when you consider that women who live together tend to cycle together, oh, God. It's kind of like whenever gay marriage comes up and some conservatives say, well, if guys can marry other guys and gals can marry other gals, why can't we marry animals? It's like, dude, why did you go there? What exactly is it in your mind that makes you, but there is an answer to that, by the way. The answer is, the reason it's not okay to marry an animal is because an animal cannot enter into a contract. Right? That's why. That's why you cannot legalize horse-man marriages. Like the guy in South Carolina, twice convicted of having sex with a horse. The same horse. It's apparently a good-looking horse. So we'll come back on Thursday, pick it up here. So remember, last thing in class, bestiality. See ya.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. Should say 1336. It just doesn't. Okay. So last time we had covered Reynolds versus the United States, that Mormons cannot practice polygamy even though they believe in it. You can believe in it, then that's fine, but you simply cannot practice it. Okay, and actually just scroll down a little bit faster. Perhaps too fast. That figures. Okay. All right. Low lights for free exercise of religion include, the Smith versus Oregon decision. Yeah, that's right. I can't edit this. Smith versus Oregon, a 1990 decision. Oregon has one of these bullshit zero tolerance policies on drug use. I use the word bullshit because there was a case here in Houston just a few years ago where a girl was having an asthma attack, but her inhaler was empty. They found another kid who also had asthma. He gave the little girl his asthma, his breathalyzer thing, and it saved her life. And then he was kicked out of school because under the HISD drug policy, it's zero tolerance. Anytime a kid gives a drug to another kid, out, automatic suspension from school, even if it was to save the life of the student. Then they decided maybe they need to rewrite their zero tolerance drug policy thing, because there's always an exception to every rule, except for that one. Okay, so prior to Smith versus Oregon, states could only outlaw religious practices if the state could show that the person who were engaged in that religious practice were being harmed by it, that something bad was happening to them, such as in the practice of snake handling. Okay, wrong snake. Snake handling. Every state but Alabama has outlawed snake handling, a practice usually performed by folks living on the western slopes of the Appalachian Mountains, otherwise known as hillbillies. And they interpret a section of Matthew to say that it says that if you spread the word of Jesus, nothing bad will happen to you, to mean that if you lock yourself in a room with a bunch of poisonous snakes, and you encourage the snakes to bite you, or you drink poisonous snake venom, then it will become a test of your faith, that you will become enraptured, you will begin to speak in tongues, and you will become closer to God, which is why 49 states have outlawed it, because at almost every ceremony, somebody was getting a little bit closer to God than they were counting on. So they outlaw that, and that's fine. But I wonder if they ever noticed that it was the fat guys that had the strongest faith. Because as it turns out, fat cells absorb snake poison. And so, that's why I always try to carry an extra 30 or 40 pounds around on me at all times, deadly afraid of snake bites. That's my excuse. All right, so in any case, so after Smith versus Oregon, states can outlaw any religious practice it wants to, even if the practice's harm is only theoretical or hypothetical. The case itself dealt with a Navajo Indian in Oregon, not where they were from originally, by the way. Navajo Indian in Oregon, who works for the state of Oregon, smokes peyote during a religious ceremony. The next week he is subject to a suspiciously random drug test. Turns up positive for peyote, they fire him. Now, it's legal to smoke peyote if you're a member of the Native American church. If you're smoking it during the religious ceremony. You might not want to walk down the street with it. And it's legal. And so he was basically fired from his job, not for using an illegal drug, but for using a legal drug. And he was still fired. And he said, look, this is discriminatory because the only people that are going to get fired, first, I was using a legal drug. Secondly, you're only going to be firing Navajos. You're only going to be firing Native Americans. That members of my church cannot get a job with the state of Oregon is what you're saying. And Scalia said, well, yeah, that's what we're saying. The state of Oregon doesn't have to hire you if they don't want to. If they don't want to hire any members of your church, they don't have to. That any state can outlaw any religious practice it wants to, even if no actual harm comes to the participant. That's a quote from the decision written by Scalia. Any state can outlaw any religious practice, even if no harm comes to the participant. And so people on the political left and the political right got very upset with this opinion. It did increase state governmental powers, but at the expense of free exercise of religion. I can't think of a much better example of what I was talking about Tuesday than this one right here. Are state government powers increased in this decision? Absolutely they are. Is the increase in power of the state governments, does that increase religious liberty? Or does that decrease religious liberty? At least potentially. It decreases it. That when you start going down non-lethal religious practices, any one of them could be outlawed. Giving communion to minors, outlawed. Full immersion baptism, outlawed. And in fact, there you do have harm. There was a tragic case about 10 years ago where a minister who was taking his new congregants to be baptized in the San Jacinto River. And during the baptism ceremony, one of the congregants was walking out and slipped and fell into a hole and was swept downstream and drowned, which is tragic, but raises an interesting theological question. If you believe you can't get into heaven unless you've been baptized, but you die during the baptism ceremony, how does that work? Do they give you a pass on that one? Do they sit there and say, what the heck, close enough, A for effort? Well, in any case, so this case was a huge defeat for religious freedom. A subsequent law, the Religious Liberties Restoration Act, was passed 3 years later by 95% of both houses of Congress, signed by President Clinton, which said that states can only outlaw religious practices that cause clear harm to the people. And the Supreme Court declared the Religious Liberties Restoration Act of 1993 unconstitutional in the Bernie decision of 1995 or 1997. And so Smith versus Oregon is still the law of the land. Any state can outlaw any religious practice it wants to. Scalia even said, look, the reason you're being discriminated against is because you're a minority religion. Just get used to it. It's going to happen. It's like, yeah, you're right. I guess as long as you're not a member of the majority religion in your state, you can expect to be discriminated against. Too bad that maybe 220 some years ago, a group of people didn't sit down and write out a list of rights that people have that the government cannot take away. They could have called it like, I don't know, Bill of Rights, and they could have put the free exercise of religion in there. Gosh, it's just too bad nobody thought about doing that, huh? All right. Establishment issues. School prayer, 10 Commandments, creationism. There is probably no case that is more demagogued and misunderstood than Engel versus Vitale, 1962. This is a question that 75% of you will get wrong on the test. Because you have been taught, you have been told, everything you've seen and heard on television is that kids cannot pray in school. That in 1962, the Supreme Court said kids cannot pray in the public schools. They kicked God out of the schools in the 1960s. Well, here's the thing. In Engel versus Vitale, the state of New York was being sued. In the state of New York, like about 47 other states, state law required that at the beginning of the school day, after attendance has been taken, after the bell has rung, that the first order of business is for the public school teacher to perform a prayer written by the New York State Board of Regents. And so you have elected officials writing a prayer that must be performed by a government employee. And if that government employee does not recite that prayer, they may be subject to suspension or termination. So if the government employee does not perform a religious ceremony, the government employee can lose their job. Then on top of that, the children were to be in the classroom for the prayer unless they had a note from their parents excusing them from the morning prayer. So the kid decides, I don't want to pray today, not good enough. You're going to sit down and pray, Junior. You got to have a note from your mom, and then we'll get you out of the prayer. When kids were removed from the morning prayer, they were sent out into the hallway and forced to stay out in the hallway until the prayer was over, and then they were allowed back in. They found that quite a few kids were coming to school with notes from their parents, excusing themselves from morning prayers, but the kids were not giving the note to the teacher because, in their own words, they did not want to be punished for not praying. That by having the teacher recite a prayer during the school day, the kids very much got the message that they're supposed to pray, that this is something they're supposed to want to do, and that if they don't do it, you're potentially pissing off the teacher. She's going to send you out in the hallway and punish you. It's also going to set up an artificial barrier, and as incredible as it may seem, I'm actually old enough to remember school prayer. And we all knew which kid in the class was the Jewish kid because of it. You'd have never known otherwise either, by the way. So the Supreme Court said, organized school prayer as a required part of the school day in public schools is unconstitutional. It is only unconstitutional if the school is requiring the prayer to be a part of the school day and for the teacher to be leading the class in prayer. That's what's illegal. That's what's illegal. The decision does not apply to students praying on their own. If students want to pray on their own, you can't stop them. You can't stop them. If they want to pray before they eat their school lunch, or if the food tasted like the food at my school after they've eaten their school lunch, you can't stop them. If they want to pray before taking a test, you can't stop them. There's that dumbass bumper sticker, as long as there are tests, there will be prayer in schools. Well, okay. Yes, that's funny on one level, but at another level, no Supreme Court decision has ever said kids can't pray in school. It's never happened. It's a myth that most Americans believe in, but it is simply not true. The Supreme Court has never said kids can't pray. They said the public schools cannot use prayer as a part of their curriculum, as part of their school day. So students can pray on their own. That's fine. The decision does not apply to religious groups who want to pray on school property before or after school. That they must be allowed to use the school property if they want to pray or have an after-school religious group meeting of some sort. They can do that. Students can be dismissed early to go to church to receive religious instruction rather than learn something useless. like math or, geography. And that's okay. School teachers can be brought in, public school teachers can be sent to a church to teach math and history at the church school and be paid only by taxpayer funds. And that's okay. That's not a violation of separation of church and state. State aid to church schools is okay. That taxpayer money can be used to buy textbooks and equipment for church schools. And that's okay. Students and teachers praying together on school property outside of the classroom during the school day. That's fine. They can do that as well. When my kids were at Klein, teachers would join the kids around the flagpole to hold hands and pray, because apparently Jesus really liked flagpoles. Well, why aren't they praying around a cross? Why aren't they praying around a Bible? Why do they form a prayer ring around the American flag? Because they're trying to send a message that the only true Americans are Christians. That if you're not a Christian, you're not really an American. That this country is a Christian nation, was meant to be a Christian nation. That's why they hold hands around the flagpole and not around a cross, not around a Bible. They're trying to send a message that Christianity and America, one and the same. No division between the two of them. I was amazed. One Sunday morning, I was at the bowling alley off 249, and church got out and they were playing God Bless America on their bells. I guarantee you, our church did not have God Bless America on its preset bell thing. That kind of thing. So students and teachers can pray together, and that's fine. The decision does not apply to private schools or church schools or home schools. It does not outlaw the teaching of religion in public schools. You can teach about religion in public schools, but whatever you teach is going to piss people off. You want to beware. Really? You want to teach the New Testament in high school? Okay. First thing we did in our catechism class in Lutheran catechism was we went through the Gospels and looked at all the discrepancies. All the discrepancies. Because there's a shitload of discrepancy. Was Jesus born of David or was he not? Was he from Nazareth? Was he not? Were there shepherds or kings at the birth? Was he executed on Passover, the day before, the day after? That there's discretion after discretion after, there's all sorts of discrepancy after discrepancy after discrepancy, all throughout the Gospels. Oh, and then you learn that actually Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John didn't write the Gospels, by the way. So, do you really want to start teaching the historical truth about the Bible and who wrote it and when it was written and when this was added? Not? Yeah, probably not. You're going to piss off a lot of people. But that's what they do in most of the seminaries. They teach it to you and say, look, there's a problem here, problem here, problem here. Take it or leave it. Take it or leave it. A lot of people are going to leave it. All right, schools cannot promote religion. You can teach about religion as long as you don't promote it, like this religion is the right one. That religion is the wrong one. You practice this religion, you're going to go to heaven. You practice that religion, you're going to go to hell. So you could have a test question where, like, this question's okay, true or false. Christians believe Jesus is the one true Son of God. That's fine. You could have that test question. Here's the question you cannot have, true or false. Jesus is the one true Son of God. And of course the answer is that Dale Earnhardt Sr. was the one true Son of God. 10th-year anniversary of his death there at Daytona, which then of course caused the greatest joke ever written. What does Dale Earnhardt Sr. and Pink Floyd have in common? Their last big hit was The Wall. So do you see the difference between asking about religion and asking of it? Do you see? Okay. Folks upset with Engel want to use public schools to promote their religious viewpoints. They are not quite so anxious if it's somebody else's religious viewpoints that are being promoted. Like when I was at a brown bag luncheon at Tomball a few years ago. And I was the, liberal brought shipped in from Houston to give a different perspective to the brain that everybody out in Tomball shares. And when this guy sitting next to me started demagoguing about bringing back school prayer, and everybody cheered. And of course, I was expected to say no. I said, hey, that's fine. Bring back school prayer. Who's going to write the prayer? Oh, the local school board is. Oh, okay, local school board. And if most of the people on the school board are Protestant, it'll be a Protestant prayer, right? And if most of them are Catholic, it'll be a Catholic prayer, right? And if most of them are Muslim, it's going to be Muslim. Whoa, 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 whoa. You mean there's school districts in this country where Christians aren't in the majority? Well, yeah. There's a couple in New York where Jews are in the majority. There's a couple outside of Detroit where Muslims are in the majority. But you're okay with that, right? You know, if most of the people are Wiccans, you're okay with a Wiccan prayer or perhaps the sacrifice of a small bird. You're okay with that, right? Because otherwise that would be hypocritical of you to only be in favor of your religion being exercised, but not these other people's religions being exercised. And all of a sudden, it's like the air all went out of the room, that nobody had ever given serious consideration to that. I mean, one woman even, like I said, she, is that true? Did that happen? You know, like, you know, so all of a sudden it was like, interesting idea. Everybody having the right to practice religion by keeping the government out of it. Interesting concept. But again, people that want public school prayer don't believe in separation of church and state. Period. When Tom DeLay was elected to the House of Representatives and was interviewed by Washington Post Weekly about what was his main goals, he said one of his main goals was to eliminate the separation of church and state. That he was going to push for a constitutional amendment, which he never did, which would eliminate separation of church and state, which would allow the national government and the states to adopt fundamentalist Christianity as the one true religion. His religion would become everybody's religion. And then it was pointed out to him that 87% of Christians are not fundamentalists. What do you say to them? And he said, well, the truth hurts. So it's not about, they don't believe in separation of church and state. They want to use the government to spread the good news, to spread the gospel. Okay? Like Ann Coulter, September 13th, 2001. We should invade their countries, kill their leaders, and convert them to Christianity. Yeah, that'll do it. I'm sure we can get that done in 6 or 7 years, no problem at all. That's exactly what we'll do. We'll just convert them, and if they don't convert, Ann, what do we do to them, Ann? What did we do to them, Ann, when they wouldn't convert? Right? But she doesn't care because she knows that the people that listen to her have little birds flying around above their head all day long. You know, like, now, let's look at the death toll from 2001. Now, from 2001 to today, how many Americans have been killed on American soil by Muslims? 3,000. How many Americans on American soil have been murdered by Christians? About 90% of murderers identify themselves as Christians. Okay, that's about 20,000 homicides a year. So, okay, about 18,000 a year for about 10 years. So that's about 180,000 Americans killed by Christians and about 3,000 by Muslims. So, you know, just so you know what the scorecard is. Just so you know what the scorecard is. That the Muslims had one really good day, but Christians are just kind of on the slow burn, you know. That we'll just churn it out year after year after year, you know. So here's a couple angles on this that you might not have considered. Number one, do you really want to put the folks who run FEMA, Amtrak, and the Postal Service in charge of educating people about religion? Seriously? You want to put the government in charge of teaching religion? You want to put the public schools in America in charge of teaching religion? Seriously? How well do the public schools do teaching Americans about math? We're the most math-ignorant democracy on earth. What about geography? 17% of Americans cannot find the United States on a world map. Okay, it goes on and on and on. You're well aware of how stupid we are as a country, thanks to our stupid public education system that just keeps getting dumber and dumber and dumber. And all they do is come up with grade quotas for colleges, which is another issue we'll get to. So in any case, so do you really want to put the government in charge of that? Because in Europe, most of the European countries, including the English, still have an official church. They still have an official religion. And on Sunday mornings, their churches are largely empty. In America, the churches are largely full. You really want to put the government in charge of teaching about religion? Then another angle. In the New Testament, right in the lead up to the Lord's Prayer, Jesus tells his disciples that the Pharisees pray in public so that everybody can see how holy they are. That when you pray to your Father, you should pray behind a closed and locked door. so that you can have a one-on-one communication thing going on. So there's even a question about whether or not public school prayer is consistent with the teachings of Jesus. But it is consistent with the idea of promoting Christianity as the ideal religion and as promoting a Christian American as the greatest person on earth, blessed by God. That's why they want to do it. That's why they want to do it. The Ten Commandments are not okay to hang in the school classrooms, that they are okay to hang outside the courthouse. Inside the courthouse, you're a little bit iffy on that one. There's a case with the Texas Capitol where they put the Ten Commandments on display outside the courthouse, outside the state capitol. That was okay. That was fine. There was a case in Kentucky where they built a courthouse, and when you went up the steps, the first thing you saw was like this 20-foot high, big-ass wide Ten Commandments facing you with the light shining down on it. They said, no, not okay. The justification is, well, you see, if you have the Ten Commandments up there, it will teach people how to behave themselves. Right. That people will sit there and say, Jesus, I'm going to kill somebody today. Wait a minute. Oh, shit, number 7, I can't do that. Damn it. Oh, well, you know, that the justification is in the same brown bag lunch, and this came up as well. What? The Ten Commandments is the basis of all of our laws. Really? The Ten Commandments is the basis of all of our laws. What's the first commandment? What's the first commandment? Thou shalt have no other gods before thee. Right. What is the penalty for that in Texas? What is the penalty for not believing in God? Is that a misdemeanor? Is that a felony? Is that a class 4 felony, which is a technical felony, but you go to a state jail facility for up to 2 years? What is that penalty? You've got 2 commandments about not coveting stuff. You're not supposed to want what your neighbor has. Seriously, in America? You're not supposed to want what your neighbor has in America? That's the engine that drives our economy. Coveting is what makes our economy roll along. And as soon as people quit coveting, we're in trouble. As long as they keep wanting bigger houses and cooler cell phones, the economy roars along. As soon as people are like, you know what? I'm okay with my cell phone. I don't need another house. I'll just drive my car into the dust. Our economy falls apart. Coveting is built into our society. You have to covet. What is the penalty for not coveting? What's the penalty for not obeying or honoring your father and your mother? What exactly is that one? Is that 6 months? Is that 9 months? What is the penalty for that? There are 2 things in the Ten Commandments that are that's against the law. You can't steal and you can't kill. As it turns out, this is not the first time in human history that a society told its people to quit killing and stealing. That it's not unique to the Old Testament. There's lots of other societies that came up with that before then, kind of thing. But not if you ask Sherry Shepherd on The View. They were having a philosophical discussion one day on The View. Thank God I didn't see it. My head would have exploded. Where Sherry Shepherd, they were talking about how like Aristotle or Socrates was like the first philosopher. And she's like, no, it was Jesus. And it's like, well, no. Aristotle and those guys lived before Jesus did. He goes, no, I don't think so. I think they came after. You know, Jesus was the first philosopher. Sherry, the Bible's divided into 2 parts. There's the New Testament, and there's the Old Testament. It's called Old because it came first before the New one. And there's some philosophers in there you might have heard of, like, I don't know, Moses and people like that. Just so you know. So, Jesus, even within the context of that, get that one right. God. Okay. What do you get? Well, and the reason this is an issue is because, well, in order to try to get the votes from all of these very righteous people, you have people like Mike Huckabee running for president in 2012, who has already stated that his goal is to get every law from the Old Testament and make it a law in the United States. That if it's illegal in the Old Testament, it should be illegal in America. Now, does Mike Huckabee really believe that? Of course not. He's not an idiot. But he's from Arkansas, which is pretty close. He's from Arkansas, and he wants to get that Southern fundamentalist vote because those people vote. He wants to get the true believers to vote for him. Now, here's the thing. relatively few Americans actually know what's in the Old Testament. There was a survey about 6 months ago that asked Americans, what do you believe? And then asked them specifically sub-things inside of that. For example, like most Catholics did not know that according to the Catholic Church, when you do communion and eat the wafer, it's actually you're eating Jesus' flesh. And when you drink the wine, you are actually drinking his blood. You're not symbolically drinking his blood, but it turns into his blood once it's inside your mouth. And most Catholics didn't know. Really? We believe that? Huh. You know, and same thing with the literal interpretation of Genesis and all sorts of other stuff as well. That most people say they're religious, but they don't actually have any idea what the hell they're supposed to believe in other than God. And after that, you're pretty much on your own. What we do get from the Old Testament, though, sexual repression, rape victims having to marry their rapists. Yeah, that was an Old Testament law. The Crusades, the suppression of astronomy, archaeology, anthropology, biology, physics, chemistry, rapid transmission of AIDS, overpopulation, and subsequent environmental degradation. Most of the conflicts in the Middle East today comes from the Old Testament. The reason why they cannot define where a Palestinian state begins and Israel ends is because they both want control of Jerusalem. Why? Because according to everybody's story on how the world ends, whoever controls Jerusalem will win Armageddon. Whoever controls Jerusalem will win the Battle of Armageddon when the seven-headed dragon flies in to consume the earth. And that is the basis of international relations. Revelations. At least in that part of the world. The most conflictual, nastiest area of the world. Everywhere else where they're like, yeah, here's the thing. I'm not going to lose sleep over the lizard. Much more peaceful, as it turns out. Creationism was held not to be a science. Creationism was an attempt by the 13% of Christians who are fundamentalists to take their fundamentalist interpretation of Genesis and to make it public school curriculum. That you had to teach the fundamentalist origins of the universe according to Genesis on an equal par with evolution. That if you teach evolution, you have to teach the fundamentalist interpretation of Genesis, and you have to teach the fundamentalist interpretation as being just as legally valid as the theory of evolution. Or you could choose not to teach evolution. And if you don't teach evolution, you don't have to teach the fundamentalist theory of creation. And so the Supreme Court took up that case and they said, here's the problem, guys. There is a reason why we want to teach people science, including the theory of evolution. But religion, teaching people that the earth was created in 6 24-hour increments on October 23rd, 6,110 years ago, according to a Catholic bishop a while back, so it's more than 6,110 years ago now. That's religion. You can't disprove it. You can't prove that wrong. Because every time you come up with something like radiocarbon dating or igneous and sedimentary rocks, the answer is yes, but that's man analyzing the data, and man is sinful and therefore flawed, therefore his data is wrong. That I've had this conversation many times. There were no dinosaurs. These were simply bones planted by Satan to make us believe that there were dinosaurs. But there were no such thing as dinosaurs. For example, they've never found a complete dinosaur. It's like, yes, they have. They found hundreds of complete dinosaurs. I mean, again, this was news to my community college students just a few years ago. It's like, really? Like, yeah, go to a museum sometime. You know, yeah, okay, maybe they're missing a tooth. Okay. You know, but they got 99% of the other stuff, right? Well, there's that one time they found a dinosaur bone and they had it wrong and the animal didn't even exist. Yeah, you're right, 1840 that happened. In 1840. By the time they put Jurassic Park together, they're doing all right with the dinosaur thing. They pretty much got it figured out. But you can't believe in dinosaurs because that would make the Earth much older than it is, so you just decide there's no dinosaurs, and any evidence of it is, nah. That's how you deal with it. So creationism is held not to be a science. Creationists argue secular humanism, teaching science rather than religion, is itself a religion. So, in other words, religion is a religion, and non-religion is a religion. Therefore, religion and non-religion are both religion. And religion is non-religion. Now, if we apply that logic to similar situations, let's try that with money. Money is money. No money is money. Therefore, if you have no money, you have money. And if you have money, you have none. Let's try that with the verb. Running is running. Not running is running. So if I'm running, I'm running. And if I'm running, I'm not. In the meantime, church income is not taxed. Church property is not taxed. Now, church income. I mean, yes, the minister has to pay a tax on what he receives as income. He has to pay that. But the church itself does not have to pay income. For example, Robert Tilden, who throughout the entire decade of the 1990s averaged $180 million a year in donations, a televangelist pulling in 200 gur per year. How much did he pay in taxes on that? Zero. Not a dime. He only drew a salary of $350,000 a year, and he paid taxes on that. But the other $179 million, not a penny, not a dime. And in his defense is, well, but my church board decides how that money is to be spent. Oh, that's fair, like a corporation. Except who was on the church board? Well, let's see, him, his wife, and his secretary. They were on the church board. That sounds like a great board to be on. I want to be on a board that gets to decide how $180 million a year is spent. I'd love to be on that board. And as it turns out, they decided, for example, the guy needed about half a dozen estates in half a dozen different states, none of which pay taxes because they're all parsonages, because churches don't pay property taxes on the parsonages where the ministers live. And so he had all these estates that don't pay property taxes on them, yachts, cars, not just cars, Mercedeses. And when he would go on a retreat to Vail or Aspen or Monte Carlo, the church paid for it because he wasn't going on vacation. He was going on retreat, so that he could go somewhere quiet like Monte Carlo and read the Bible and contemplate the meaning of the universe so his followers could be better informed as to how to go to heaven without getting sidetracked. So church property is not taxed. Church income is not taxed. State tax dollars can be used to buy books at church schools. School districts can use taxpayer money to reimburse students who take a bus to a church school. So here's an idea. Let's trade. Let's bring back school prayer, hang the Ten Commandments, and teach creationism. In exchange, churches will have to pay property and income taxes. Let's do it. Let's make that. We got a budget shortfall right now in both the country and in Texas. Let's do it. Let's make that deal right now. Somebody call Pat Robertson. Got a deal for you, Pat. We're going to do everything you've been fighting for the last 40 years. Children are going to get the shit kicked out of them if they don't pray. Okay? We're going to hang the Ten Commandments. Not only are we going to hang the Ten Commandments, they're going to be like in 3D so you can see it with the glasses and everything. We'll require the Ten Commandments to be played before every motion picture at every movie theater. We'll make it mandatory. You have to teach about the Ten Commandments. We'll do all of that shit, but you have to start paying taxes. What do you say? Willing to make that deal? No, they're not. Not at all. But there you go. I'm all about consensus. I'm all about, okay, I'll come halfway. Let's do all this. This is all crap anyway, because if you really want to teach your kids this stuff, there's nobody stopping you from teaching your kids this stuff, obviously. Do you really want to put the public schools in charge of shit? All right, what about intelligent design? Neither intelligent design nor creationism has been held to be a science. Why? Well, because they each generate untestable hypotheses. One of the other reasons is because whenever they talk about why it is that you want to have intelligent design be part of the curriculum, the universal answer is because I want people to learn about God. Sorry, that's promoting religion. That's promoting religion. You can't use the public schools to promote the religion. But you know what you can use? You can use the church. You can use the church to promote religion. You can use the media. You can use that to promote religion. You can even get off your ass and teach it to your kids if you want to sometime. But you can't use the schools to promote religion. Science generates hypotheses. That can be disproven with data. Religion does not. If you really believe 2 + 2 = 5, you're going to believe 2 + 2 = 5. And no amount of data is going to convince you otherwise. That's just how it's going to work. In order to prove an intelligent being created the universe, you'd have to set up a situation where the outcome would be X if the universe was not created by God, and the outcome would be Y if he did. And maybe you could get a grant for that. That and maybe finding the Noah's Ark. So that's all that paragraph is telling us. Religion is based on faith, thus faith. Faith is believing something despite the evidence. Science is believing something because of the evidence. In both cases, belief is involved, but one is believing stuff while rejecting the data. The other is believing stuff because of the data. It's not the same thing. Anybody who tells you that is just wrong. Due process amendments 4, 5, and 6 lay out the process by which the government has to follow these processes before they can deny you your civil rights, before they can throw you in jail, before they can execute you, before they can terminate you from Lone Star College. They're supposed to follow these due process procedures. Now, two big cases here. Weeks versus United States, 1914, establishes the exclusionary rule for federal law enforcement. This means that if the federal law enforcement comes into your house, they search your house in 1914, but they do not have a search warrant, then none of the evidence that they find can be used in court against you. Now, the reason most of the books, not that you have to read the chapter, but the reason most books don't have this is because it was very ineffective. Because it only applied to federal law enforcement, it did not apply to state or local law enforcement. And so you're Elliot Ness, you're working for the U.S. Treasury Department, you're trying to bust up Al Capone, you want to search his apartment, but you don't have a search warrant because you don't have probable cause. No problem. You get the Chicago police to search his apartment because the Chicago police don't need the search warrant. And so Weeks versus the United States established an important, concept that the police should not break the law to enforce the law. A very basic concept. But it was ineffective in its application because it only applied to federal law enforcement until 1961. Then in 1961, in Mapp versus Ohio, the Supreme Court said, here's the thing. You know that exclusionary rule that has only applied to federal law enforcement since 1914? It now applies to the states as well. It now applies to the states as well. And so that was the incorporation case. For the exclusionary rule. Mapp versus Ohio. There's other cases, but this is an introductory class. Now, what happened is, over time, you would hear cases of where somebody got their house searched, and they found a map, they followed the map, and they found a shovel. They used the shovel to dig up a body, but because they did not have a search warrant, not only can they not use the map, but they can't use the shovel and they can't use the body. And so you hear these horrific cases of people getting off scot-free because the police had conducted a warrantless search. And it ticked off Americans who are very law and order oriented. And so in the 1980s, one of the things that the Reagan justices did on the Supreme Court is they tried to correct the balance, as they saw it, between the rights of the accused and the rights of society. So they started adding a few exceptions to the exclusionary rule so that the police can go ahead and conduct a warrantless search and they can still use the evidence against you. Now, any one of these on their own, I would submit, is reasonable enough. Any one of these, you can make a really good case. We know there should be exceptions to the law. There should be. There should be no such thing as zero tolerance on drugs, or you can never do a search without a search warrant. There should be exceptions for everything. But when you look at the exceptions in total, you have to really manufacture a creative circumstance under which the police are not going to be able to put something into evidence against you, even without a search warrant. For example, one of the first ones out of the box, plain sight. If the police are driving down your street, they can see something through your window, they can come on into your house, grab it, and arrest you, and use that in court against you. It's called the plain sight rule. If the police come to your door and ask you, is this your dog that's running loose here, and you open the door and they see your hookah set down on your dining room table, they can come on in, grab it, use it in court against you. So there's a plain sight exception. Perfectly fine. But then later on, the Supreme Court added to that with the plain exception, where police flying over your house using photo reconnaissance don't need a search warrant to come onto your property and to use that evidence against you. That's cool. It does not apply to cars. Since the 1920s, it does not apply to cars. Now, initially, the idea was cars need to be impounded before the police can search them. When the police pull you over, they could only search the area under the driver's control. That has changed now, so that anytime you're pulled over by the police officer, they can search anywhere in your car they want to. Lock, trunk, inside something locked in the trunk, and they want to take out your spare tire to see if there's anything under the spare tire in the trunk, they can do that too. So anytime you get pulled over in a car, they can search the entire car if they want to, without a search warrant. And the Supreme Court said, well, you see, when you leave your house, you have voluntarily given up your Fourth Amendment rights. That your Fourth Amendment rights only apply when you're at home and on your own property. But once you have left your property, you have an implied consent to be searched. In other words, the Fourth Amendment does not travel with you. It just stays home. Even though that's not what it actually says in the Fourth Amendment. It does not apply to trailers or people that live in trailers either, because they can be moved out of jurisdiction before the search warrant comes in. The garbage can exception. In this case, the police asked garbage men to go grab this guy's garbage cans off of his property and then give the police his garbage. They did. They found evidence of drug use. They arrested and convicted the guy. He appealed his conviction saying, but the police didn't have a search warrant. They got this evidence and they had no, they knew they couldn't get a search warrant because they had no probable cause. They asked the garbage officers to basically act as police officers by going and grabbing the garbage. My conviction should be overthrown. I should get a new trial without that being part of the new trial. And the Supreme Court disagreed. Check it out if you want. California versus Greenwood, 1986. The Supreme Court said, look, when you throw something into your garbage can, you have relinquished your constitutional ownership of it. Once it's in your garbage can, you have relinquished your constitutional ownership of it. Like, really? I have? When I put my garbage into my garbage can, and my garbage can is on my property, I don't constitutionally own the garbage inside the garbage can. The garbage can itself is still mine. The property is still mine. But the stuff inside the garbage can is not mine. I seem to remember being billed last month for garbage pickup. Seems to me that I paid money last month to somebody to pick up my garbage. Apparently, I am foolish for having done this. I should just let the sheriff's department pay for my garbage pickup because apparently it's their garbage. As soon as I put it in my garbage can, it becomes theirs. So next time you set the garbage out by the curb, dog gets into it, spreads it out all over the yard, neighbors start to complain. They say, hey, California versus Greenwood, 1986. That's not my garbage. That garbage belongs to the sheriff's department. Call them, have them pick it up because it's not my garbage. Good faith exception is my favorite one. You know, everybody has their own favorites. This is my personal favorite. It's like my generation's version of Rolling Stones versus Beatles kind of thing. But this is my personal favorite. Under the good faith exception, if the police serve a search warrant that the judge forgot to sign, or it has the wrong address on it, that's okay. Because if the police are willing to testify under oath that in good faith they thought it was a valid search warrant, then it becomes a valid search warrant. This sounds like something that would be written by a Zen master, you know, like Yoda. You know, that is why you failed. You know, do or do not. There is no try. You know, that kind of thing. I can usually do better than that. And so the good faith exception, all you have to do is believe in it, and it becomes what you want it to be. If only life worked like that, that if you believed you were debt-free, you were debt-free. You know, that kind of a thing. All right. The endangerment exception. If the police believe that somebody's life is in danger or immediate danger, or that evidence is being destroyed. They can come onto the property, grab whatever it is they want to grab, and use it against you, even if later on it's proven that they're wrong, even if later on nobody was in danger, even if later on you can establish nothing was being destroyed. They can still use it. Sweep search. In this case, police were called to somebody's house. They asked the people to turn down the music. They're having a party. But then when the police opened the door, they could smell something that was out of hand. And so they went into the house and ticketed everybody, almost everybody. And the people who got the ticket said, but the police weren't asked to enter, and they didn't have a search warrant, and they were only sent to tell us to turn down the music, and we agreed. But we opened the door and they came on in. And the Supreme Court said, okay, that's fine, because number one, if the police are called to your property for any other reason, and you open the door to the police, that is an invitation to enter. Anytime you open a door to a police officer, that is an invitation for that officer to enter your house. It's like, really? Does everybody who comes knocking at your door somebody that you want in your house? In my case, it's almost never somebody that I want in my house, right? So anytime you open the door to a police officer, that is an invitation to enter. And then once they enter, they can conduct a sweep search without a search warrant. And anything they can find in their sweep can be used against you. Now, that does not mean that they can go behind closed doors. That does not mean that they can make you open up the contents of your purse, theoretically. Yes?
Does that mean that how you find it? Like if they knock on your door?
Don't open it. Yeah, probably. Make them bust it down. As soon as they bust it down, they need a search warrant. Yeah. Yeah.
Even though like actually like 11 that they said that they had every right to, even though like they broke the door, everything they like throw them out.
Yeah, they do.
So how did it play that long?
Well, did they have a search warrant? Oh, they didn't have a search warrant. Well, they could use almost any excuse. They thought somebody was in danger. They thought evidence was being destroyed.
Because they like out action time.
What was the justification they gave you?
They said they didn't have the right to do it.
Yeah, sounds right. Because we want to. Because we want to. Because we want to. Beats me. But that's pretty typical. I mean, I've had cases in my life where a police came into my house too without asking first or knocking or anything, searching without a search warrant, not for anything that I had done. Yeah. Yeah, and so they busted it out. And they didn't have a search warrant. Huh. Well, it would have been very easy for them to say, well, they thought they heard somebody screaming, or they thought there were drugs and they heard a toilet flushing, so they came on in. So they can do that. So they can, that's all they have to do, and which is really easy in my house, because in my house, some genius designed my house so that the first floor toilet is right next to the front door. You know, right next to it. And yeah, because of our poor insulation, you can hear it when you're outside on the porch. Yes? Is probable cause an exception? Well, it depends on what the probable cause is. I mean, it's up to a judge to decide what is or is not probable cause. And if the judge decides there's probable cause, which is, there's no really big, hard and fast rule on that. Very quickly, you learn which judges to go ask for search warrants for. Because if 12 say no, you can probably find one that'll say yes. We have 22 district court judges here in Harris County alone. If 21 say no, but the 22nd one says yes, you've got yourself a search warrant. So right away, it's not that hard to get a search warrant. Plus, this is all academic anyway. Because Houston police officers were caught on tape, no, not beating the shit out of some kid, not that one. No, not screwing up all the DNA evidence in the lab so that people were wrongfully convicted and others who should have been convicted were allowed to go free. Nope, not that one. Houston police officers were caught on tape admitting that when they have to do a search at night, they don't want to wake up the judges. So there's a guy down at the DA's office who has all these blank search warrants in his drawer or file cabinet. And when they need a late night search warrant, they go to the DA's office. He takes out the blank search warrant, and the police just fill it out, sign the judge's name to it. And then they use that as the search warrant, which is illegal, unconstitutional. But they said, yeah, that's just what they do. That's just how it is done. So we're only talking here in our ivory tower constitutional law, because on the streets, none of this matters. Only on TV shows does anybody get a conviction overturned on a technicality. And even because in the real world, it's like 1 out of 1,000. 1 out of 1,000 convictions are overturned because of a technicality. On television, somebody measured it. It's 1 out of 4. And so it gives people a really exaggerated sense of how often it takes place in the whole bit, and makes them much more willing to flush their rights right down the toilet along with that marijuana. Just speaking theoretically. So invitation and suite search are actually interlinked. It does not apply to schools. We can search you. We can search your car. We can search your backpack. We can search your purse any damn time we want to. And there's a couple of other exceptions as well. Obviously, Super Bowl, that kind of thing. Fifth Amendment, no double jeopardy, no self-incrimination. There are other things, but again, we're not going to cover all of them. First off, double jeopardy is so misunderstood that even the movie Double Jeopardy got it wrong. With Tommy Lee Jones and Ashley Judd, which I've done this not horrible, but I just raked that movie apart on how bad they blew it, legally speaking, and just how the story is so implausible to begin with. My favorite part is where Ashley Judd is running away from Tommy Lee Jones. He arrests her, and they're on this ferry boat, and then he leaves her in the car on the ferry boat with the keys in the ignition. And so then she starts the car and drives the car into the lake so that Tommy Lee Jones will have no choice as a bounty hunter to jump into the water, get into the car, and unhandcuff her so she doesn't drown. And then as he does that, she overpowers him and swims away from the boat, because she is the only human being in the world who can swim faster than a boat can swim. Can you go through the water. You take the world's fastest swimmer and an old man like me in a rowboat, I kick that guy's ass every time. Okay? So you get the idea. And that was just, don't want to get too much further into that, but in any case, they got it wrong. This is how it works. If you are found not guilty at your first trial by the state of Texas, let's say, then the state of Texas cannot try you a second time for that particular offense. So if you're tried for speeding on I-45 at midnight last night and you're found not guilty, they can never go back and try you again for speeding. But if you speed down the road, they can get you for that. That's a separate incident. Okay. It does not apply if you are found guilty and then later a high court throws out your conviction and decides that you need a retrial. When they throw out your conviction legally, it wipes the slate clean. It's as if your first trial never existed. It does not apply if a different government tries an individual for the same crime. So for example, after the Rodney King cops were found not guilty by a California court of beating the crap out of Rodney King after he had clearly surrendered, despite the fact that I saw him do it along with 90 million other Americans on TV, nonetheless, the federal government came in and tried them and convicted them in a facility for a while instead of a state facility. And no, it was not a minimum security facility. Terry Nichols was found guilty in federal court for helping Timothy McVeigh to plot, plan, and build the bomb that killed all those people in the Oklahoma City bombing back in 1995. After he was convicted in federal court, Oklahoma wanted a piece of his ass and tried him in Oklahoma court and found him guilty. But neither one sent him to death row. And so he went back to federal custody. So that is not covered under double jeopardy. Double jeopardy, well, give you a couple examples out of history. This guy named Palco was accused of killing a Connecticut state trooper. He is tried and found not guilty. But then later on, new evidence is found that indicates that he committed a crime. So the state of Connecticut tries him a second time for having killed that state police officer. At the second trial, he is found guilty. He appeals his conviction in 1938 to the Supreme Court. and says, look, that the no double jeopardy clause of the United States Constitution should apply to state governments too. And the Supreme Court disagreed, and he was executed. 31 years later, in Benton versus Maryland, Benton, pretty much the same thing, wasn't a state trooper. Benton is accused of, I don't know what the crime was, quite frankly. Benton was convicted at a second trial. At the first trial, Benton was tried, found not guilty. At the second trial, they were tried, found guilty. He appealed saying that double jeopardy should apply to the states, and the Supreme Court agreed. So you win a few, you lose a few. That's how double jeopardy works. The other big Fifth Amendment issue is coerced confession. Coerced confession. This starts with Brown versus Mississippi back in 1938, when the Supreme Court outlawed the third degree, that you cannot torture people into confessing and use that confession in open court. And of course, this has become an issue recently with the Bush administration administering torture, something that the president now admits to and says he is proud of, and then using the evidence from the torture to convict this guy and other people based on his testimony. Of course, one of the problems with torture is, yes, it can be effective if you have a guilty party. It can also get you to confess to damn near anything, as it turns out, and is generally considered not the most reliable method, unless you're really sure you got the guy. But even people that we tortured at Guantanamo Bay said shit that later turned out couldn't possibly have been true. They just wanted the battery cables off of their testicles, as it turns out. So, later on, there's a case involving Miranda has kidnapped and raped an 18-year-old girl. She gives the description to the police. The police arrest him and tell him effectively that if you don't confess, you're going to get the death penalty. So he writes up a confession. The confession is the only piece of evidence used against him in court, and he is convicted. And then his conviction is appealed, stating that, look, you can't trick somebody who, like Miranda, who was borderline mentally challenged, and tell them that, you know, horrible shit's going to happen to them if they don't sign a confession. That's coercion. That's coercion. You can't do that. There is some coercion is okay, but this goes beyond the pale. Now, what makes Miranda very controversial and really hard for even myself to, embrace is not only did the court say that you have to read the suspect their rights, but the court actually wrote what you had to say. That you have to tell a suspect that he has the right to remain silent, and anything he say can or may be used against him in a court of law. That if he cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for him. So you actually have the Supreme Court writing down what police officers have to say to somebody before they can interrogate them. And so that's, from a purely philosophical standpoint, a very long way away from beating somebody into confession. On the other hand, you're right. You don't want to trick people. You want to make sure that you're not putting somebody in prison who shouldn't be going to prison, and have given them some false incentive or promise them something that you can't possibly promise them. Like, we'll give you $1 million if you confess. Really? Yeah, here it is. It's all yours if you confess. Oh, okay. You can't do that because there are, quite a few folks out there that are just not quite, like any member of the Lohan family. You get the idea there? Okay. So Miranda versus Arizona. Miranda is retried. He is convicted, by the way. He doesn't walk free. He gets a retrial. He's convicted. He goes to prison. He gets out. He's at a poker party. Somebody gets pissed at him and stabs him to death. The guy who stabbed him to death was read his Miranda rights after he killed Miranda. True story. Now, here's the other thing. They only have to read you your rights if they're about to interrogate you. They do not have to read you your rights upon arrest. They only have to read you your rights if they intend to interrogate you. I've had more than a few students over the years who said, well, I was at UT, got drunk, disorderly, arrested, drunk tank for the weekend. They let me out, but they never read me my rights. Can I appeal the conviction? No. They never interrogated you, right? They never asked you any questions. They never asked you to turn over evidence. They never asked you who helped you or that thing, right? Yeah, they just arrested me, I passed out, I woke up, I was in jail. Okay. They don't have to read you your rights. They only have to read you your rights if they intend to interrogate you. So, upon arrest, like they do on TV, is not the way it really works. Sixth Amendment has many trial provisions in it: fair trial, right to an attorney, speedy trial, right to confront witnesses. The one thing that keeps killing me about this one is that until 1948, you did not have the right to a fair trial in some states. That you could have the victim's family on the jury, and that was okay. That the prosecutor could also be the judge, and that was okay until 1948. Not 1848, not 1748, 1948. Right to an attorney, speedy trial. The big one, Gideon versus Wainwright. Gideon is convicted of having broken into a business that he had the keys to and stealing some money out of a soda machine that he had the keys to. And he wrote his own appeal to the United States Supreme Court and said, look, I asked for an attorney so that I could present my own defense, but I could not afford an attorney. And I was asked for one, I was turned down. Other states let their people have attorneys whether or not they could afford them. Florida does not. It seems to me, under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, that if the people in State X have the right to an attorney, people in State Y should also have the right to an attorney. That it is a fundamental right, and the Supreme Court agrees and overturns his conviction, which results in a new trial where he is found not guilty. They made a movie about it called Gideon's Trumpet, starring the late Henry Fonda, one of the great actors from Nebraska, along with Fred Astaire, Marlon Brando, and then entertainers like Dick Cavett, and Johnny Carson, and myself. So Gideon versus Wainwright, you now have the right to an attorney if you cannot afford one for felonies. For felonies. Later, they expanded that to cover serious misdemeanors. So in Texas, Class A misdemeanor or above, you have the right to an attorney. All right, whether or not you can afford one. The 8th and 9th Amendments are largely state issues. The yellow states on the map represent states that have the death penalty. The blue states represent states that do not. However, this isn't the best map in the world because they treat all the yellow states as if they all have it equally. For example, Texas executes one person about every 2 to 3 weeks. Montana has executed 2 people in its entire history, period. So it does have the death penalty on the books, but hasn't executed anybody for a while. Texas executes somebody every other week or so. Nonetheless, the point is, the death penalty is very popular in the United States. The great vast majority of states have the death penalty. There must be something about the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Seaway, though, that affects the folks up there. In the brown-colored states here, laws have recently been introduced, bills have been introduced, to abolish the death penalty. Only in New Jersey did the law actually pass a couple of years ago. New Jersey did abolish the death penalty a couple of years ago. Massachusetts had it for a while in the 90s and then got rid of it again. But big deal. I mean, sure, every legislative session, somebody in the Texas legislature proposes getting rid of the death penalty in Texas. You might as well propose outlawing high school football in Texas, because it's just not going to happen. It's not going to happen. We not only have the death penalty in Texas, we are the king of the death penalty state. Okay, we execute more people than any other state, far and away. For the longest time, half of the people executed in America since 1976 were executed in Texas. Now we're down to about 30-some%. So we really need to pick that up. Come on, guys. The American Bar Association now officially supports abolishing the death penalty. Now that is interesting. Because when the American Bar Association decided that segregated public education needs to go, it went about 6 or 7 years later. When they said that voting restrictions should be abolished, voting restrictions were later abolished. And now that they've said the death penalty needs to go, yeah, I don't think so. Good luck with that one. Good luck with that one. But it does show that the legal community is basically turned against it. They decided, no, there's just too much crap attached to the death penalty. That it's really, really hard to get to the people who deserve to die without also inadvertently getting people along the way who maybe did it but didn't deserve to die or didn't even do it, type of thing. It's doubtful most states will do this. The issue is, do we trust the government to flawlessly execute the worst of the worst without political ambition or government incompetence getting in the way? The issue regarding the death penalty should not be, in my own view, whether or not some people deserve to die, because absolutely some people deserve to die. Absolutely, that's the case. If you can kill the right people at the right moment in time, you could make the world a much better place. You kill Hitler in July of 1944, you save 10 million lives. Now, if you kill him before that, you might not have actually saved somebody because somebody competent might have taken over Germany at that point and they might have still won the war. But you get the idea. You kill the right person at the right moment, and certainly there are mad dog, horrible, terrible son of a bitches out there who, if allowed loose or even allowed to run loose in prison, are just going to kill more people. They're going to be a problem. That until we can better understand how to stop that and treat it as a mental disease, geez, you know. But there's a lot of downside to this, which we'll get to next Tuesday, because I'm not going to spend 1 minute on the death penalty on a Thursday afternoon. See you on Tuesday. We'll pick it up here. No cruel or unusual punishment usually means the death penalty. We're talking about the death penalty here. The yellow states have the death penalty at least on the books. Some, like Texas, have executed a couple hundred people. Montana's executed 2. But nonetheless, they do have the death penalty. In the yellow states, the blue states do not. The death penalty is clearly constitutional under original intent standards, so is slavery. The brown states are the states where they've recently introduced bills to outlaw the death penalty, and in a few they got it shot. But in most of them, that's not going to happen. Not going to happen. The American Bar Association now officially supports abolishing the death penalty. That when the American Bar Association generally comes out in favor of something, it usually happens. When they come out against something, it usually goes away. And so they run the legal profession in this country. We'll see what kind of an effect they're going to be able to have on this one, though. Because if there's one thing we love to do in this country, is kill. We do a better job of it than damn near anybody, except lately the Mexicans have been kicking our ass on that one. All right. The issue with the death penalty, hopefully, is not whether some people deserve to die, because certainly some people deserve to die for the crimes that they've committed. And others just deserve to die on general principle. But in any case, hopefully that's not the issue. The issue is, do we trust the government to make sure that only the worst of the worst of the worst get executed without political ambition or social prejudice get in the way? Do we trust the people who run FEMA, Amtrak, the Postal Service, the Welcome Center? Do we trust Rick Perry, George W. Bush, Dick Cheney to decide who should live or die in this country? Do we really want to give the government that much power over our own lives? Which is why you find opposition to the death penalty on both political extremes, on both the political left and on the political right. Constitutional issues associated with the death penalty. There are 4. Number 1, discrimination, but not what you might think. There are, women commit 10% of the homicides in the United States. But women make up less than 1% of the people that are on death row. That in order for somebody to go to death row, first, they must commit a capital offense. A capital offense is defined by state law. That in Texas, only certain types of homicides count as a capital offense. Just killing somebody doesn't put you on death row in Texas. Just killing somebody doesn't do it. If you kill a child, defined as under age 12, or is it 10? If you kill a police officer in the line of duty, or a firefighter in the line of duty, that kind of thing. If it's a felony murder where you are committing a felony, like you were committing a bank heist and you shot and killed the guard, and that you intended to shoot and kill the guard, then you're eligible for capital murder. Multiple murders are capital murder. So just killing somebody does not put you on death row in any state. And yet, that is one of the most missed questions over this part of the test. True or false? Just killing somebody is good enough to put you on death row in Texas? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Less than 1% of the people who are convicted of murder are convicted of capital murder. That capital murder is the rarest of crimes. But you would never know that from watching television. Television unfortunately steers us in very different directions away from reality. So do the movies, which, you would think intellectually, of course, I know that, but then later on talk about the Kennedy assassination and other stuff. But in JFK it says they made that shit up. They changed the facts in the movie, that kind of stuff. Historians really hate the movies. They almost never get anything right historically. But in any case, you get the idea. So women rarely get the death penalty. First, the prosecutors got to be willing to ask for the death penalty, and then the jury has to be willing to implement it. And that's usually simply not the case. Jurors can't bring themselves to execute a woman. They cannot, prosecutors often fear political backlash for going after a woman, and not from the people that you might think. For example, Susan Smith was separated from her husband with 2 small children, was dating a man who just made some off-the-cuff comment about, well, I've never really, thought about having kids or anything. And then she used that as the excuse to take her kids, strap them into the back seat of the car, and push the car into a lake. Then she reported to the police that somebody had just carjacked her car and had taken off with her kids inside. So the police investigate and ask questions, and they never bought into it. They said never from day one. Not for a minute did they believe it, because they know that carjackers do not kidnap children. You carjack a car, 2 years in prison. Kidnap a child, life in prison. That there's all sorts of stories around here, and I'm sure there'll be one in a few months, once again, where somebody left their keys in their car and the car running when they went into the convenience store, and when they came out, the car was gone with their kid inside. And then the police found the car 3 blocks away. That it never happens. Nobody ever carjacks a car with children inside of it and then decides, well, what the hell, I guess I'll just kill the children. Because, capital murder, carjacking, it's about the same punishment, I think, for the 2 of those things. We almost forgive people for carjacking cars, as it turns out. But in any case, and of course, if it's a Kia, you're actually doing the person a favor by carjacking. It's like, thank you. So, she claimed that a black man in South Carolina, a black man had carjacked the car, and, in her own words, whatever he's done with the children is on him. And, of course, the police find the car in a lake with the kids still strapped into the back seat, and with her palm prints clearly on the back trunk of the car. And in the meantime, she went on the Today Show. She went on CNN. She went on all these different cable news shows and network news shows, CBS This Morning, all of those shows, and just cried and bawled her eyes out while her separated husband tried to calm her down and talked about how she wants her kids back and the whole bit. And so then she was arrested and tried for capital murder. The prosecutor in South Carolina did try to put her on death row. He said, look, if there's anybody who deserves to go to death row for what they did, it's her. But the jury couldn't do it. The jury could not send her to death row, in part because during the sentencing phase of the trial, she took the stand and cried her eyes out about how sorry she was that she had deliberately drowned her children. That kind of shit. She didn't even claim to be deranged. There was no proof of derangement of any kind. They just, were slowing down her social life. And they did it. They spared her life. Now, we can leave the race factor out of it because we know what the answer to that is. But what if a man had carjacked that car and then had pushed that car into a lake? Any doubt in anybody's mind that that guy would be on death row in South Carolina? Okay, he might have been executed by now, but you get the idea, right? Any doubt that guy would have been sent to death row for that? Of course not. Of course there's no doubt about that. It definitely happens that way. That this country still has a problem with executing women. Even women that do really heinous crimes. The other example, Carla Faye Tucker was the first woman executed in Texas since the Civil War. And by happy coincidence, I covered this in 1337 in a different context yesterday. And Carla Faye Tucker was a multiple pickaxe murderer. She killed several people, and she killed them all with pickaxes. She tied them down so that they were defenseless, and then she got on top of them with a pickaxe and killed them by just putting the pickaxe into their body time and time and time again. So they died in excruciatingly slow and painful death. In one of her victims, she put the pickaxe into their body 57 times. At her trial, she was asked, why did you put the pickaxe into this person's body 57 times? And she said that every time she put the pickaxe into the body, she had an orgasm. Which is why I could never be a multiple pickaxe murderer. That once I put the pickaxe in the body, I'd be done for 3 or 4 days at least. How about Friday morning, maybe? Thursday night if I go to Walgreens? So Carla Faye Tucker is up to be executed. First woman to be executed in Texas since the Civil War. Now at this time, about 1998, 1999, we had already executed 150 people in Texas since 1976 alone. But they were all men. This is the first time that we executed a woman since the Civil War. And so she makes a video where she pleads with Governor Bush to spare her life, even though he cannot commute or pardon her. And they have pictures of her holding up socks that she knitted for the other inmates. And that she had turned her life around and had become a prison minister and routinely counseled other prisoners on turning their life around and giving their hearts to Jesus. And it worked. The Christian Coalition, led by Pat Robertson, the only Christian organization on earth that supports the death penalty, came to her rescue, arguing, as when Pat Robertson was interviewed on 60 Minutes with Leslie Stahl. She asked him, how come you guys do not want to see Carla Faye Tucker executed? And he said, well, Leslie, you got to understand it. You see, Carla Faye Tucker is a woman who's given her life to Jesus. And we think that she deserves forgiveness. And so then Leslie Stahl asked only one of two obvious questions. Well, you know, Reverend Robertson, there's over 4,400 men on death row across the United States. Surely one or two of them have sincerely turned their lives around and have given their hearts to Jesus. How come you have never tried to stop any of them from being executed? And from the look on his face, it was obvious that that had never occurred to him. He didn't see the question coming. He didn't have a prepared off-the-cuff response for that one. It's like, well, Leslie, you raised a good issue, and maybe we're going to have to go back and reevaluate our position on this issue. Really? You think? You might have to go back and reevaluate your position on the issue? You're a Christian organization in favor of killing people. You're the only one on earth that's in favor of that. What you're effectively saying is, if Jesus were alive today, he'd be in favor of the death penalty. Yeah. Why isn't he alive today to tell us directly how he feels about the death penalty? Let's see. Was he hit by a train? No. Did he drown? No. How could Jesus drown? Did he fall off a mountain? No, wait. He could fly. It says so in the Bible that Jesus flew right up to heaven, that he was lifted up into the air. Jesus could fly. So he couldn't have fallen off a mountain. He couldn't have drowned. So Jesus, what happened to Jesus? Oh, that's right. He was executed. So I'm sure if he hadn't been executed, he would be all in favor of execution. See, that's the problem with the Christian coalition. They almost never quote the gospel. They almost never take anything from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and apply it to anything. They almost never quote Jesus. They quote Paul. They'll quote the Old Testament, but they almost never quote Jesus because Jesus really gets in the way of their particular version of Christianity. Jesus is a bit of an embarrassment for them, right? I mean, because the way I was taught it doesn't mean that I'm right, but the way I was taught was people are so sinful that if a perfect person were to walk amongst us, we'd have to kill him because he doesn't fit in. That the whole story of the execution of Jesus involves a politician who went to the mob and he said, I will let one of these guys go. You guys decide, Jesus or the murderer Barabbas. Guess who the mob said to execute? Jesus. We want Jesus dead. Pilate keeps trying to talk everybody out, but he hasn't done anything. And they're like, if you don't kill this son of a bitch, you're going to have a riot on your hands. And Pilate's like, really? That's what you guys want. If that's what it's going to take for me to remain as governor of Palestine, I'll do it. To save my political career, I'll kill him. And somehow, people don't get that. That politicians will put their own careers ahead of the lives of people, even killing people, for them to stay in office. And somehow, people don't get that. And certainly nobody in the Christian coalition seems to get that one, interestingly enough. Well, okay, so Jesus was executed. You know, it's not like he ever stopped anybody from being executed, like some woman that was being stoned for, oh, wait. That guy. Yeah, but it says in the Bible, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Yeah, except why is it that the Jews had to go to the Romans to get the Romans to execute him? That's because under Jewish law, they didn't have executions. It was against Jewish law for them to kill anybody. And yet Jewish law is based entirely on the Old Testament. Interesting how that works. They didn't have a death penalty, but the Romans did, as it turns out. Interesting idea. So, anyway, Carla Faye Tucker was eventually executed. And Governor Bush would not commute her sentence. Because he couldn't. He wouldn't recommend it either. So that's one form of discrimination. Women who commit crimes, women who commit capital offenses are far less likely to get the death penalty than men who commit very similar crimes. Killers of whites are executed at higher rates than killers of minorities. It's about a 4-to-1 ratio. If you kill a white person, you are 4 times more likely to get the death penalty than if you kill a black or Hispanic person. That again shows that prosecutors have to be willing to ask for the death penalty when the victim is a minority person. That Henry Wade of Roe versus Wade fame in Dallas was the prosecutor in Dallas for over 30 years. He asked for the death penalty in over 100 cases, but in every single case the victim was white. As it turns out, during those 30 years, there were some blacks and Hispanics who were victims of capital murder, but he never once asked for the death penalty for any of them. Same thing with Atlanta. In a case that came up in the 1990s before the Supreme Court, they were able to demonstrate that no prosecutor in Atlanta, Fulton County, had ever, in recorded history of Georgia, asked for the death penalty when the victim was not white. That every single time they had ever asked for the death penalty in Fulton County, it was because a white person had been killed. Yeah. If you are a white person and you kill a white person, you are 4 times more likely to get the death penalty than if you're a black person who kills the white person. So today, the race of the murderer is no longer a major concern. It was in 1972 for the court. But since 1976, when they brought it back, it's not the race of the murderer that matters, it's the race of the person that they killed that matters. That this means, apparently, that jurors and prosecutors value the life of a white person more than they value the life of a minority person, apparently. And so there's that. Rich folks, or folks who can afford to hire their own attorneys rather than having a court-appointed attorney, almost never go to death row. They get convicted 90% of the time, but they almost never go to death row. And the few who do usually are able to get their sentence commuted to life in prison. That, as the court said long time ago, in 1972, it still applies today. If we had a law in the books that said that if you commit capital murder, you can only go to death row if you make less than $15,000 a year, if you have less than 100 IQ, and if you are a high school dropout. And if you had a court-appointed attorney. People would be outraged that that law was on the books. But for all practical purposes, that's who goes to death row. People with slightly lower than average intelligence, people with court-appointed attorneys, people who are poor and uneducated. That makes up damn near everybody on death row. The Ted Bundys and the John Wayne Gacy's are really outliers. They're statistical flukes when it comes to people on death row. Cost is not a good argument either way, but it should be pointed out, and this shocks people, it costs more to execute somebody than to keep them in prison for the rest of their life. The reason for this are several. Number one, nobody plea bargains to death row, no matter how bad their court-appointed attorney is. Right? Nobody sits there and says, yeah, I just talked to the DA. He's willing to execute you if you would want to forego a trial. If you waive your right to a trial, they'll execute you. I say we take the deal. Right? Nobody plea bargains to death row. In fact, the Supreme Court has ruled you cannot plea bargain to death row. You cannot accept a death sentence. You have to have a trial to go to death row. The court has also ruled that only a jury can sentence people to death row. That in a few states like Nebraska, judges were allowed to sentence people. And the Supreme Court said, nope, you can't do that. Jury has to sentence you. Jury has to sentence you. So there's the trial. That everybody who is on death row has a trial. That's not true for most murderers. Most of the murderers that go to prison, 90% of the murderers that are convicted of murder have plea bargains. That only about 10% have a trial, and of those, most of those are the capital punishment people. So you have the trial. Then to house people on death row, there's extra security. That costs a lot. And yes, the appeals process really slows things down. You could make the death penalty more cost effective by cutting back on the appeals process. But if you cut back on the appeals process, you increase the number of innocent people that are going to get executed. You just have to find your comfort zone. How many innocent people are you willing to kill to get to the ones that deserve to die? The University of Iowa has done a bunch of studies on this. They found, for example, that in the 20th century, 1,500 people were sentenced to death row who were later shown to be innocent. 1,500 sent to death row. Of those 1,500 that were sent to death row, 24 were executed. That means the other 1,476 were able to use the appeals process to point out that they were innocent and get out of it. So if you make it more cost effective, you kill more innocent people. And so there's that comes into it. On the other hand, so it costs more to execute than life in prison. When New Jersey outlawed the death penalty in 2008, one of the arguments in favor of it was it's going to save us a shitload of money. When Kansas decided to add the death penalty back around 2000, one of the arguments against it was, but you understand, we're going to need more judges, we're going to need more lawyers. This is going to cost us a lot of money. We have to build a new facility to house these guys. I mean, this is going to cost a shitload of money. When Kansas adopted the death penalty, it barely passed. And because of the cost issue, because they knew it was going to cost more to have the death penalty than not to have the death penalty. On the other hand, you can also argue that having the death penalty may make it easier to get a plea bargain out of somebody. That without the death penalty, there's little incentive for somebody to plea bargain. And so that might avoid a trial that you might otherwise have. Well, maybe. But that's not one of those provable things. Okay. Deterrence. It keeps people from killing each other. That Governor Bush of Texas, when running for president in 2000, was asked, how can you support the death penalty, seeing as how your favorite political philosopher is Jesus Christ? That's what he said. In his first debates in New Hampshire, everybody was asked to list their favorite political philosopher, and he listed Jesus Christ. Okay, here's yet another problem. Yeah, as a philosopher, Jesus, oh yeah, absolutely right. As a philosopher, right. A political philosopher. Yeah, not a lot of politics in there. Not a lot of Jesus telling anything about politics. In fact, at one point, Simon Peter tried to talk him into directing a little bit of anger against the Romans and maybe using his following to start a political movement to get the Romans to leave the Holy Land. And Jesus says, I'm not going to do that. That's the whole render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's kind of a thing. So, maybe Governor Bush should read the gospel sometime. That if Jesus is his favorite political philosopher, that would have been great. It's like, really? Exactly which of his political philosophies do you like the most? But, of course, the guy was so taken aback by that and probably never been to Sunday school his whole freaking life that he was like, oh, okay, moving on. As I was saying, who's your favorite political philosopher? Peyton Manning. Peyton Manning. Political philosopher? Jesus Christ, political philosopher? Seriously? Political philosopher. Jesus. Philosopher, absolutely right. Political philosopher, not so much. Not so much. No, that's not a put down. Okay, so Bush was asked, why, do you have a death penalty in Texas? Why do you guys love it so much? And he said the only reason, he'd like to say that a lot, by the way, the only reason we have a death penalty is because it stops people from killing each other. Really? It stops people from killing each other. Okay. That's an interesting hypothesis, doesn't it? Because it would seem that if the death penalty is a deterrent, then states that have the death penalty should have a lower homicide rate than states that do not. And states where the death penalty is handed out more routinely than others should have a lower homicide rate. And cities and counties that send a lot of people to death row should have the lowest homicide rate. Well, here's the problem. First, you can see on the chart, over the years, all the way to 2006, which is the last year that I've got data. I'm not trying to be clever here and leave out the last 4 years because the data goes in the other direction, because it does not. Well, when you look at states that don't have the death penalty and compare them with states that do have the death penalty, what do you find? That the states without the death penalty have a 40% lower homicide rate than states that do have the death penalty. Right there, to be generous, you can say that data does not support the hypothesis. Another issue, if there is any place in the world where you should be absolutely safe from homicide, it's Harris County, Texas. Right here. This is ground zero for the death penalty. Houston, Texas, Harris County, Texas, has more people on death row than any other city or county in America, than any other city or county in Texas. And so the homicide rate here in Harris County should be substantially lower than the homicide rate in Dallas or San Antonio, because we send more people to death row out of Harris County than San Antonio and Dallas combined. 25% of the people on death row in Texas are from Harris County, but 25% of the homicides in Texas are not committed in Harris County. Does Harris County have a higher homicide rate than Dallas-Fort Worth? Do they have a higher homicide rate than San Antonio? Or do we have a lower homicide rate? We have a higher one. We have a higher one. Most years. There's always an exception. But for most years, 9 out of 10 years, Harris County, Texas, Houston, Texas, is going to have a higher homicide rate than any other county in Texas. And Harris County, Texas has a higher homicide rate than Los Angeles or any other comparably sized city or county as well, even though they don't put as many people on death row. And of course, Texas has executed more people since 1976 than any other state. 4 out of every 10 people executed in America since 1976 have been executed up there in Huntsville. So the homicide rate in Texas should be substantially below the national average if the death penalty is a deterrent. But it's not. The homicide rate in Texas is higher than the other large states. Because you don't want to compare Texas to Iowa. You don't want to compare Texas to South Dakota. You compare Texas to the other big states, yeah, our homicide rate's higher. So that the data doesn't come in. There's all sorts of other ways to slice and dice this as well. Take states that look like each other, demographically. Connecticut's always had the death penalty. Massachusetts generally has not. Both states are very similar in terms of percent college education, per capita income, percent urbanization, percent non-white. Very similar states. Connecticut's always had the death penalty. Massachusetts not. Guess which state has the higher homicide rate? Connecticut does. The state with the death penalty has the higher homicide rate. Virginia and West Virginia. Virginia is richer than West Virginia. It's better educated than West Virginia. Virginia is second to Texas in carrying out execution. The homicide rate in Virginia is higher than it is in West Virginia. Kansas and Nebraska. Kansas just got the death penalty about a decade ago. Nebraska has always had the death penalty. Nebraska has half the population of Kansas. Nebraska has a smaller percentage of people living in cities, urban areas. Nebraska has a smaller minority population than Kansas has. And Nebraska has always had a higher homicide rate than Kansas has. Washington and Oregon, same story. Washington State's always had the death penalty. Oregon is not. Similar demographics, similar income. And guess what? Washington State has always had a higher homicide rate than Oregon has had. Yes?
Is there any explanation why it's going against that really just kind of happened?
No, there's not. Some death penalty opponents, of which I am not, I'm actually supporting the death penalty. I'm just pointing out bullshit arguments you shouldn't make in favor of it. One of the arguments that anti-death penalty people make is, and that George Will, the conservative columnist, says is the best explanation for this, is that the death penalty brutalizes society where it's carried out. It causes people to be less respectful of the sanctity of human life. I don't buy into that. I think there is a third variable affecting both the homicide rate and the rate of execution. And I think that is probably a value of human life thing going on. In states with a high value or relatively high value of human life, you have people that are less likely to see homicide as the solution to their problem, and you have a government that is less likely to see killing the people as the solution to their problem. Now, how would you measure that in a scientifically reliable way? People have tried. People have tried. But that's my best explanation for it. It's a third variable affecting both of them. And yes, it should be pointed out that the southern states have higher homicide rates and higher execution rates. States that had slavery still have higher homicide rates and higher execution rates than any other states, even when you control for the percent of the minority population. So, you know, that there's some things that are sort of handed down generation to generation, like attitudes about life and death and the whole bit, and I think that's probably it. And Jesus, look at the history of Texas and how much violence was involved in getting Texas up and running. Don't get me wrong, there's not a single state in this country that wasn't born out of killing a shitload of people. But when it comes to killing a shitload of people, okay, we're near the top. We're near the top. There is, yes, they had to kill people to form Iowa. And then there's, yes, we had to kill people to get Texas. But we had to kill a shitload more people than Iowa had to. So that might be it. That might be it. But there's also the other issue of, philosophically, what kind of a view of mankind does that betray? That the only reason right now that you're not trying to kill me and I'm not trying to kill you, the only reason is because we fear government sanction. The only reason we're not murderers is not because we don't have it in us. It's because we're afraid of going to death row and being executed for it. Seriously? If you really wanted to kill somebody, do you think that would stop you? Right? It doesn't stop anybody. All right, look at all the murder-suicides. When some guy gets pissed off at his wife, kills her, kills the children, and then kills himself. Right? Was that guy afraid to die? Of course not. Of course not. Does the death penalty make you afraid to die? Assuming you've never killed anybody. At least not yet. After all, day's not done. One of my favorite lines ever in any movie was from City Slickers, where they go through, hey, Curly, kill anyone yet today? Day's not done. Good point. So, in any case, all right. So I mean, really, that's the only reason we're not killing each other is because we fear government sanction. I mean, that betrays this view of common people as just being a bunch of murdering scumbags, and the only way we can stop them from doing it is to kill one of them every once in a while to just show them who's in charge. And it's like, wow, that's almost exactly what Jesus said. I mean, since Jesus is his favorite political philosopher. Yeah. It's almost like Jesus himself was speaking through Governor Bush when he said that. Okay. All right. And then when you start looking at other countries that have the death penalty and other countries that do not, you do not want to look at the data. It gets even worse. It gets even worse. I mean, even Seattle and Vancouver, 2 hours apart, virtually the same size, demographics the same. Seattle homicide rate 5 times higher than in Canada. Buffalo and Montreal, same thing. Any city south of the border versus any city north of the border nearby. Calgary versus, Great Falls. You get the idea. The homicide rate per person is always higher than in the United States than in any comparable Canadian city. Not that you can always find a comparable Canadian city, but you get the idea. Right? There's no such thing as the Canadian version of Vegas, for example. Or Birmingham, for that matter. In any case, I got a lot of friends from Canada. This friend of mine who's a comic was from Regina and would talk about his days growing up in Regina. He called them the Regina monologues. And he talked about how one of the most famous athletes from Saskatchewan was a victim of thalidomide. This was a drug that they gave to women to avoid sickness, morning sickness when they were pregnant in the early 60s. It was never approved in America, but it was approved in Canada. And when you would take it, babies would be born without arms or legs. And this guy was born without any shoulders or arms. And he was like the greatest long-distance runner, greatest Olympic athlete from Saskatchewan, won some gold medal one time or something like that. And they decided to name a highway in Canada after him, except it was this highway way out in the middle of nowhere, where there wasn't even enough room to pull over on the side. And he was like, why the hell would you name a highway after this guy? It's like, oh, wait, the highway doesn't have any shoulders. So when you look at countries who are democracies, and you look at the ones that have the death penalty and ones that do not, it becomes even more askew than it already does. Fourth issue is irreversibility. No explanation here. Once you've executed an innocent person, it's hard to bring them back. Same thing with their sperm. There is a case filed by the California death penalty people on death row in California about 10 years ago. They were arguing that when they are executed, their sperm is killed, and that they are potentially killing all these innocent babies. And so they were suing for the right to have their sperm preserved, just in case a woman decides that she would later like to become impregnated with the sperm of a death row prisoner. And people are like, who would want to do that? Thousands of women. Thousands of women. That there are women who are attracted to people in prison. Shit, they'll marry them knowing they're never going to get out of prison. That kind of thing. And of course, if you're married while in prison, couldn't that be like a form of double jeopardy? Being punished twice for the same... I didn't say who, you just assumed it was for the guy. Okay, fine. But yeah, there's women that do that all the time. I mean, Ted Bundy got love letters and marriage requests, and John Wayne Gacy. and Ramirez, the night strangler out there in California, who's in for life in prison. He gets marriage proposals all the time from women who want to hook up with him in the whole bit. So there is a market for that. The Supreme Court, by the way, ruled, sorry, your sperm goes. You go with you. All right, who can we legally kill? The retarded? Not anymore. And I know we can't use the term retarded anymore. Okay, people from Arkansas. Now, while the Supreme Court has ruled, okay, what happens is this. 1991, I go to this political science conference in Little Rock with Dr. Keith Hammett Rice. He can confirm much of the story. The governor of Arkansas was going to make a speech. This guy named Bill Clinton, we decided, don't give a shit. Plus, it's happy hour in the bar. So he's got plaster the whole time. This bitchy woman was barking orders at all these different people coming in and out of there and stuff. And then she would stare at us, and we just our soul would freeze up inside of us. You could probably figure out who it was, right? So when everybody says, oh no, if you actually meet Hillary and know her, she's a wonderful, warm person. I don't think so. I saw her up close a long time ago. Scared the shit out of me. Of course, that could mean she'd be a great president, that anytime she's with some conference and she says, and the Russians like, no, we're not interested in this. Really? Okay, just don't look at us like that again, that kind of thing. But in any case, so I'm going to the airport. Before 9/11, right? When you can put AK-47s on planes, they just ask you not to shoot them off until after the plane has, landed. I just got this little carry-on bag like this. Just have my suit and my dress shoes and stuff in there. I was wearing my other clothes, but I had a ponytail, wearing a Hawaiian shirt with cutoff that apparently I fit some sort of profile. So, the girl working, no, not woman, girl, literally, working the x-ray machine with this dishwater blonde hair down to here and obviously a homemade dress and really bad teeth. She stops my bag as it goes through the x-ray machine. She says, sir, there's something in this bag that I do not recognize. Do you have shovels in your bag? Shovels. In my carry-on. Well, like little hand shovels and stuff? Okay, no. Are they prohibited now? Are you not allowed to take shovels onto airplanes? I mean, now, of course, right? You can't take this onto the airplane, right? So they called the security guard over, opened up the bag. You know what it was that she saw in the x-ray that she could not recognize? My dress shoes. And my initial reaction was, oh my God, what a moron. She can't even recognize dress shoes when they go through the x-ray machine. Then I thought about it. Wait a minute. I'm in Arkansas. She's probably never seen dress shoes. Plus, she must have been a lot smarter than I give her credit for. She saw that I was already wearing shoes. Therefore, those can't be shoes in that bag. Right? Nobody's that rich. Nobody's got that kind of money. Hell, there can't be shoes. What, you got 4 feet or something? Who needs more than one pair of shoes? Shoot, are you a horse? Only horses got 4 shoes. So that's my Arkansas story. Also in Arkansas, if you have an IQ of 86, you are not considered mentally impaired. Seriously. Seriously. In most states, any IQ of less than 100, you're considered mentally impaired. In Arkansas, genius. So, the mentally impaired, no. Minors, not anymore. If you were 17 or younger when you committed the crime, you cannot be executed. But you can go to prison. where a bunch of older men are more than happy to welcome you with open arms into the prison. Sometimes people equate not going to death row with getting away with it. And there are worse things in life than death. Right? There are. We always assume that killing somebody is the worst thing you can do to them. Not necessarily. I think you can make a pretty good case that life in prison without the possibility of parole is worse. Because when you're like in your 80s and you can't defend yourself against anybody and you're not getting out of prison until you're dead, that's not a good position to be in, plus, wrinkles tickle. So, there's something wrong. The insane. No, you cannot execute anybody who's insane. But Oklahoma had a case of a guy who was insane. Insanity meaning you cannot tell the difference between reality and fantasy, much like Michelle Bachman. So he had completely lost his mind. They gave him some experimental antipsychotic drugs. They worked. He was able to then grasp reality, and the unreal shit went away. And so then they put him back on death row because he had regained his sanity. And he said, no, I'd rather be alive and insane. I loved all the pretty unicorns that I saw flying around all day. So I want to go off my meds. And Oklahoma said, no, we want to make you well so we can kill you. And the case went to the United States Supreme Court, and the United States Supreme Court sided with the state of Oklahoma. Yes, you can force somebody to take medicine against their will so they regain their sanity so you can kill them. If a state bars new evidence from being introduced in the death penalty appeal after a certain date, even though the evidence may exonerate the defendant, can the state carry out the execution anyway? And the answer is yes. Herrera versus Collins, 1993. Herrera had no criminal record, but Houston police officers were involved in a fatal shootout. A couple officers were killed in a shootout with a guy who looked a lot like Herrera, from witnesses who were 100 yards away dodging bullets. Herrera is eventually found. Somebody fitting his description, Herrera's description, is found. He's found. The eyewitnesses testify that, yes, this is the man who I saw kill those police officers. He is sentenced to death row. Then what happens is his older brother is involved in a shootout with Houston police officers. One of the problems with the original Herrera trial was they never found the murder weapon. Guess what? They're about to find the murder weapon in the hands of his dead brother after the Houston cops shoot him dead. The bullets match the bullets from the other dead police officers. And the older brother had a long and extensive criminal record. And so and then when his picture is shown to many of the original eyewitnesses, they recant their stories. Because now they're not sure if it was the Herrera that's on death row or the Herrera who was just shot and killed, who actually killed the cops. And so Herrera attempts to get this evidence submitted to demonstrate that he is not guilty of the crime that he's been convicted of, which would then give him a new trial. But here's the problem. Texas had passed a law which said once you have been sentenced to death row, you have 30 days to produce new evidence showing that you did not commit the crime. And once the 30 days goes by, a deadline's a deadline. That the state, that no judge can look at that evidence after 30 days. And so Herrera asked to get the evidence submitted. He was said no. He was turned away. He appealed his decision, this case, all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And in Herrera versus Collins, the Supreme Court said, yes, a deadline's a deadline. If evidence comes in showing that this person did not commit the crime, but it comes in after the 30 days, then the state may go ahead and execute the person, which is exactly what happened to Herrera. That the state may carry out the execution even though the evidence clearly shows that the person did not commit the crime. So in other words, it is constitutional for states to kill people, even if the state believes the person is innocent, as long as the state gave the person a trial, gave them a lawyer, gave them the right to cross-examine witnesses. That, in other words, there's constitutional guilty and there's real world guilty. And if in the real world you are not guilty, but in the eyes of the court you're guilty, it's the eyes of the court that triumph over the real world. There's legal guilt and actual guilt. And the court established the idea that if the two are at odds with one another, legal guilt beats real guilt. Legal guilt beats real guilt. For example, Rehnquist's opinion for the majority noted that few rulings would be more disruptive of our federal system than to provide for habeas corpus review of freestanding claims of innocence. In other words, our justice system is not designed to prevent innocent people from being punished. It is instead to punish people in as expeditiously and efficiently a manner as humanly possible. So going to the trouble of determining whether somebody being executed deserves to be executed may slow down the process. Is a reason, going to the trouble of determining whether somebody being executed may slow down execution is a reason not to slow down execution. Because we might find more innocent people. And we don't want to do that. We don't want to do that. That's the other more nefarious part of this, is that if you start finding out how many people are actually go to death row who are innocent, support for the death penalty is going to plummet. We might lose the power to kill people, and then we're going to lose control over all you guys, and you're going to just start murdering each other. O'Connor took the position that Herrera could not be legally and factually innocent because he was tried before a jury of his peers with the full panoply of protections that our Constitution affords criminal defendants. That, in other words, it's impossible to be innocent if you've been found guilty. It's impossible to be innocent if you've been found guilty. Right? It's impossible for the government to make a mistake when it happens. That you don't have the right to a fair trial. You have the right to an appearance to a fair trial. Yes?
So why have a appeal process?
I don't know. That's an excellent question. Why bother? Most of the appeals are not about innocence. Most of the appeals are about technicalities like whether or not he received an adequate defense, whether evidence was included or excluded that should have been included or excluded, whether a witness should have been allowed to talk but was not, kind of thing. So to be fair, about 90% of the appeals are on due process issues. Did the person receive a fair trial or not? The actual innocent stuff is the minority of it. So that's why you would still have it, I guess. I mean, just thinking off the, excellent question. Right, so if you are found guilty, but DNA shows you're innocent, you're still guilty. Why? Because the government followed the rules. The rule says you are guilty if we think you're guilty, not if you're actually guilty. These are great minds. Of course, there was a dissent. Blackman wrote, "We are really being asked to decide whether the Constitution forbids the execution of a person who has been validly convicted and sentenced, but who nonetheless can prove his innocence with newly discovered evidence." And he took note of the state of Texas's astonishing protestation to the contrary. Texas argued that even if there is evidence that proves beyond a reasonable doubt that this person is innocent, the state still has the right to execute that person. Go ahead. Yes, it was upheld. It's still out there. Why do they what? That's a good question too. Why not just kill them after 30 days? Once the 30 days goes by, you're gone. Done. Over. Oh, that's an excellent question. Then what's the whole point, right? We might as well be Saudi Arabia in that case. We might as well be Russia in that case. We might as well be China then, right? Because that's absolutely what we're saying here. But again, most of the appeals are not about innocence, right? The official position of the state of Texas, innocent schminnocent. Governor Bush vetoed a law that was later passed after he became president, that Governor Perry signed, that allowed for DNA testing of evidence for anyone on death row. Now here's the thing. Governor Bush vetoed a law which said if you're on death row and there is still any forensic evidence having anything to do with your crime, you have a right to ask that that evidence be subjected to DNA testing. And Governor Bush vetoed that. He vetoed that. And Governor Perry, when the legislature passed it 2 years later, the liberal Texas legislature passed it 2 years later, Governor Perry signed it. Why do you veto that? I mean, the only thing it's going to do is it's going to demonstrate that the system's not perfect. We all understand that. All it's going to do is demonstrate that every once in a while somebody goes on death row that's innocent. Why do you veto that? Who's it going to get off the death row? Innocent people. See, a lot of the folks who support the death penalty, and I've had this discussion over the last 24 years in many different venues, when it really comes down to it, they really don't care if the person being executed really did it or not. They see it as a signal to others, as a method of control for others. I've had people say that, look, it doesn't really matter if that guy's guilty or not. It sends a message to the others, you know, that they should stay in line. Plus, they've probably done something anyway. And you get people that go to bed at night and they have no trouble going to sleep believing that for their entire lives, especially here in Texas. Especially here in Texas. All right. Since Governor Perry signed that law, several folks have been let go off the death row who otherwise would have been executed. That, in other words, if Bush had lost the 2000 election, which, okay, technically he did, but if Bush had not become president and remained governor of Texas, those guys would have died. Those guys would have died. Perry saved their lives, as it turns out. The governor of Illinois in 2000 found out that half the people on death row in Illinois were innocent. Not that half the people in Illinois didn't get a fair trial. No, he found half of the people on death row in Illinois were innocent, were about to die for a crime that they did not commit. And he pardoned them. No, he didn't pardon them, he commuted their sentence. And then got criticism all over the place for having done that. The pussy. Because once again, for people on the political right, for way too many people on the political right, and there are a lot of conservatives that are opposed to the death penalty, they really don't give a shit whether the person being executed is guilty or not. It's a control mechanism. It's a way of keeping people in line. That's why you give the government that power. So what if you're innocent? Ultimately, to support the death penalty, you must support the killing of innocent people from time to time. The Supreme Court's majority in Herrera is being intellectually honest. Our justice system is not designed to weed out the innocent from the guilty. That's not what our justice system does. Our justice system is designed to determine how much punishment should be applied in this particular circumstance. And even then, it almost never does that. 90% of the people that go to prison never have a trial. 90% of the people go there as a result of a plea bargain. If you get a chance sometime, and I know you can't do this at U of H, but you really should take a criminal justice class sometime. Because of budget cuts, we can't offer those, but it's really fascinating to see how criminal justice actually works versus the way it works on Law and Order. That the differences are astounding, as it turns out. Ninth Amendment cases, right to privacy. The big case here is Griswold versus Connecticut, 1963. In this case, Connecticut had made it against the law for married people to buy, sell, use, or be in possession of contraceptive devices. Married people could not buy birth control pills. Married people could not buy or use condoms. Or any other birth control method like pictures of Donald Trump, whatever it works. And the Supreme Court said, Connecticut, you can't pass that law because under the 9th Amendment to the United States Constitution, it says people have more rights than those listed in the Bill of Rights. And one of the rights that we think people have is a right to privacy. That the right to privacy is an example of an unwritten constitutional right. Now, original intenters hate this decision because this is an example. When they talk about, like Palin and these other folks talk about how they don't want judges making law. Okay, first off, that represents, number one, a profound lack of understanding of how common law works. When you look up the definition of common law, the definition is judge-made law. Number two, what they mean is Griswold. They hate Griswold. Here the court is giving us a right just because they want to. Now, they never mention the case. They never mention Griswold. When they talk about judges passing laws, this is what they mean. They don't like this decision because the Supreme Court decided we all have a right to privacy, even though that's not written in the Constitution. Even though that's not written in the Constitution. That if you ask the average American, do you think you have an inherent right to be left alone from the government if you're not doing anything wrong? What do you suppose 9 out of 10 Americans are going to say to that? Well, of course I do. Of course I have a right to be left alone, don't I? Conservatives are like, absolutely you do not. You do not have that right. Number one, it's not written in the Constitution. Number two, if you have a right to privacy, how can we possibly bug your telephone? How can we possibly go through your mail? How can we follow you from your house to where you're assembling the uranium? You know, if you have a right to privacy, how could we ever go after you for conspiracy to commit a crime? Wouldn't that be violating your privacy? These are all arguments that Robert Bork made when he was trying to explain why he opposed people having a right to privacy while he was being confirmed onto the Supreme Court. As you can imagine, he didn't get confirmed. That it really came across from his testimony that he believed that if you just let people have a right to privacy, they'll all conspire to overthrow the government and take away rich people's stuff. It's like, right, that's what we would do. Again, it kind of betrays this inherent Hobbesian idea that people need to be controlled, that that's the purpose of government. But what makes it really controversial is what comes next. Roe versus Wade, 1973. State governments cannot prevent women from getting abortions during their first trimester. That abortion was illegal in almost every state prior to 1973. That the only way you could get an abortion in Texas, where the case originated, was if you were a victim of rape, incest, or if the doctor has determined that the continuation of the pregnancy could cause serious harm or death to you. Then you could get an abortion. One of the few states where abortion was legal was California, whose governor, in I believe it was 1969, signed the most liberal abortion law in America, so that not only could you get an abortion beyond the first trimester, but the state government even provided funding to help pay for the abortion for women who otherwise cannot afford it. The million-dollar question is, who was the governor of California who signed the most liberal abortion law in the history of the United States? Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan. Just in case you were wondering how sincerely pro-life Ronald Reagan was. There it is. When push came to shove, when he had a chance to stand up, he decided, I'm going to sign this into law. Oh, sure, maybe he changed his mind. Or maybe he was just pandering. Now I know what you're thinking. A politician pandering? That can't be. Yes? Yeah, well, what happens is with Roe, first trimester, you can get an abortion any reason you want to. Third trimester, states can ban third trimester abortion. But during the second trimester, there must be a medically necessary reason that the Supreme Court actually leaves the second trimester up to the states. Some states made it pretty easy to get a second trimester abortion. Other states made it pretty difficult to get a second trimester abortion. But during the second trimester, states may regulate second trimesters, but they cannot ban second trimesters. So it's sort of like this. First trimester, you can get an abortion for any reason you want to. Third trimester, you cannot get an abortion for any reason. Second trimester is kind of up to the states. Now, nowhere in the case was anybody arguing for the rights of the fetus. It was the rights of the woman versus the right of the state. Who should have the right to decide and at what point? And so the court kind of did the Solomon thing, with the two women claiming to have the same baby. Well, hell, we'll just cut it in half. You can both have half of it. And the one woman said, sounds good to me. And the other one was like, oh, dear God, no. And then he knew which one was the mother, the one who wanted the baby cut in half. So yes, go ahead. Well, yeah, it's risky at any point. It's risky at any point. The risk can get worse later on. But, you know, usually second trimester abortions are done because something's gone horribly wrong. You generally cannot get a second trimester abortion in this country just because you want one. Yes.
It's weird, because there are people that get their first trimester of pregnancy. There are a couple of states where it's illegal, like Utah and South Dakota.
No, it's not.
It's illegal to get an abortion there, unless you're raised or...
No, I assure you it is not. I'll bet you $100 it is not illegal. It's called Roe versus Wade. I'm from Nebraska. I've been to Utah and South Dakota. That doesn't mean anything. Yeah, Google it. Google it. How would you Google it? Prove it. Trust me. It's not illegal. I know, but it's not illegal, honey. It really isn't. It's not illegal. If it's illegal, then Roe versus Wade has been overturned, and I missed it. First off, it's legal in all 50 states. That's why they want to get rid of Roe versus Wade. They want to put it back to the states to decide whether it's legal or not. So first off, it's legal in Utah. It's legal in South Dakota. They're both states. You can't shake your head no like that. That's like saying, I know that Seattle is the capital of Washington State. It's not. It's Olympia. You're wrong. No, I'm just telling you, you're wrong. What's happened is this. Just because it's legal doesn't necessarily mean there's a clinic operating in the state. In North Dakota, all of the clinics have been shut down. Now, that doesn't mean it's illegal in North Dakota. It just means that you can't get one in North Dakota. That's not the same as illegal, right? You get the understanding. And it's North Dakota, not South Dakota. The only woman that was doing the abortions in North Dakota was flying in from Minnesota. But then that clinic was shut down, and not because North Dakota made it illegal. They can't. States can't make it illegal. That's the whole point. If states could make it illegal, the pro-life movement would go away tomorrow because that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to make it left up to every state. So no, it's not illegal in those states. I assure you it's not illegal in those states. If it is, then that Roe versus Wade's been overturned. If Roe versus Wade goes away, then yes, Utah, South Dakota, these other states would be free to make it illegal. But they can't. They're prohibited from doing that. Now, in Webster, Missouri said, look, we're not going to make it illegal, but we're going to make it hard to get. And the Supreme Court said, yes, you can do that. You can flush the clinics out in the open. In Missouri, they effectively made it illegal to do an abortion in a hospital. So instead you have a clinic where you can write down the license number of the people that work at the clinic and shoot them in their homes, which has happened on numerous occasions. In Casey, Roe was still the law of the land. In Casey, Pennsylvania asserted that it has the right to outlaw first trimester abortions. And in Casey, the Supreme Court said no state can decide whether or not a woman can get an abortion during the first trimester. It upheld Roe versus Wade. It changed a little bit about the trimester thing, but it assured that Roe versus Wade is still the law of the land. The only pro-life victory out of that is Stenberg in 2006, where the Supreme Court said some abortion techniques are illegal. Big deal. That's like saying, hey, you know, the electric chair is illegal, so we'll use the gas chamber instead. And this was celebrated as a great victory for the pro-life movement. Well, guess what? It's not really that much of a victory. You still got a dead baby on your hands. You just killed it in a different way. Then you got gay rights also based on the right to privacy. Bowers versus Hardwick, 1986. Anybody, married, single, gay, or straight, who committed sodomy, defined as anal or oral sex, in Georgia could go to prison for up to 10 years. A great place to lose that nasty habit. Right? No sodomy going on in prison. That'll teach them. You were having sex with other men. Well, okay, we're going to send you to prison. Ha! Now what are you going to do? So the Supreme Court ruled in '86, relying upon a lot of outdated psychological data where homosexuality was still considered a perversion, like child molesting. The Supreme Court said, yes, states can outlaw immoral sex, without asking the issue, why? What makes homosexual sex immoral, other than a few things in the Bible? And that raises separation of church and state issues. So then Lawrence versus Texas, we're going to go to 220. Lawrence versus Texas. When the Texas Republican Party took over the House in 2003, for the first time since Reconstruction, the Republican Party controlled the Texas House of Representatives, the Texas Senate, and the Texas governorship. One of the first laws out of the box was a law changing Texas's sodomy statute so that it was still illegal to engage in sodomy with somebody of the same sex. But it's illegal to have gay sex, but it's not illegal for heterosexuals to have gay sex. That sodomy is only illegal if your partner is the same sex as you. If your partner is the different sex than you, have fun. Here's some dumb. So what happens is, so in other words, it's now okay for heterosexuals to have sodomy, but it's not okay for homosexuals to have sodomy in Texas, as of 2004, which again, from a Freudian point of view, is really interesting. When the Republicans took over the state legislature, sodomy was on their mind. So, what happens is, two gentlemen here in Houston call in a disturbance. A former student of mine at Lone Star College gets the call with the sheriff's department. He goes into the apartment, the door is open. We all know what happens when the door is open. He goes inside and finds the two gentlemen violating the new Texas sodomy statute and each other. So, they are tried and convicted of breaking the new Texas sodomy statute. They appeal their conviction, arguing that the law is unconstitutional. And 3 appeals court judges here in Harris County hear their case, and they agree. They said that the new Texas sodomy statute violates the Texas Constitution because the Texas Constitution has an Equal Rights Amendment in it. And under the Texas Equal Rights Amendment, you cannot discriminate against anybody on the basis of gender. And of course, if you have a law that says it's okay to have sodomy with somebody or it's a crime based on the gender of the person, seems to be a violation of that amendment. When that happened, the Harris County Republican Party went ballistic. They couldn't believe it that these judges had just legalized sodomy in Texas. So they started getting petitions signed to try to get the judges impeached and removed. They started recruiting candidates to run against these judges in the next election. In an emergency session, all 13 Harris County judges met and overruled the other ones and ruled that the Texas sodomy statute is constitutional. The case was then appealed all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And in Lawrence versus Texas, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the Texas sodomy statute is unconstitutional. Not only, though, is the Texas sodomy statute unconstitutional, but so is the sodomy statute in 19 other states. And now, for the first time since the 1700s, it is once again legal to be gay in all 50 states. This has been the goal of the gay rights movement since the 1960s, to get rid of laws that make it illegal to be gay. And who do they have to thank for that? The one organization that has done more for gay rights than all other gay rights organizations put together in American history. The Harris County Republican Party. Right on!